Audrey died at the age of 27. Before her death, her husband Nigel forced her into a divorce and rekindled his relationship with his first love, Charlotte. The son she desperately gave birth to, Merlin, also recognized Charlotte as his mother, refusing to even make a phone call to her on New Year's Eve. Her cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning, caused by a gas leak from the aging pipes in her apartment building, in the moment before losing consciousness. Audrey saw the photo of herself winning the International Ballet Gold Medal. She was only 18 then. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe us to read wonderful novels every day. Now the story begins. Audrey opened her eyes again, awakened by excruciating pain in her lower body. A nurse nearby was shouting urgently, "The baby's grown too big. Hold on a little longer. The baby's almost out." The contractions showed no sign of stopping. Audrey had no time to process her shock. She could only grip the delivery bed rails until they deformed. She exerted all her strength, but just like in her previous life, the baby was too large, and an episiotomy was necessary. Without painkillers, Audrey was in so much pain she nearly passed out. After what felt like an eternity, someone finally said, "It was a close call, but congratulations, you've given birth to a healthy boy weighing 9 pounds and 6 ounces. Both mother and child are safe." Audrey had narrowly escaped death. Only then did she realize she had actually returned to the age of 22, right after giving birth to her son Merlin. What followed was a long period of postpartum recovery, accompanied by urinary incontinence, obesity, acid reflux, and pubic symphysis diastasis. Before marriage in her previous life, no one had told Audrey how terrifying childbirth could be. Later, Audrey developed postpartum depression during countless sleepless nights. She confided in those around her, and without exception, they all said she was being overly sensitive. It was just childbirth, after all. But now that she had walked through death's door once more, the known pain didn't seem as terrifying anymore. If given the choice, she would never have had a child, at least not at the cost of abandoning her career just to give birth to Merlin. Soon, Audrey was transferred to a private ward. The nurse nearby reminded her, "Mrs. Green, we've already notified your family. They should be arriving soon." Audrey suddenly remembered she had given birth alone, without anyone by her side. Nigel was too busy with work. Even though she had reached her due date, he flew abroad for a business deal without hesitation. Her mother-in-law was also occupied. As Audrey was about to enter the delivery room, she could still hear the words from the other end of the phone, "We're short one player. I'll come right after this mahjong game." Audrey remained silent for a moment before saying, "All right, thank you." The nurse asked her again, "Mrs. Green, would you like to hold your baby?" Merlin was very well behaved as a child, neither crying nor fussing, just staring at her with big, dark, gleaming eyes. There was no hint at all of the cutting resemblance he would later bear to his father's caustic demeanor. As Merlin grew up, the phrase he most often uttered was, "How could my mother be so useless? You're utterly unworthy of being my mom." Audrey shook her head weakly. "No need, just leave him in the cradle." When she woke up, it was already evening, and there was an additional person by the hospital bed. Audrey gazed at the impeccably dressed man by the bedside, Nigel, chairman of the Green family conglomerate. Even as his own wife was in labor, he remained as unhurried and graceful as ever, no different from when I first met him. And now, Audrey was swollen all over, utterly haggard. "Are you all right?" Nigel condescended to offer a single phrase. Audrey listlessly replied, "Still alive." She had always been docile, so hearing her speak this way for the first time, Nigel couldn't help but frown. Just then, Nigel's mom finally arrived in a flurry. "Oh dear, let me see my precious grandson." Without even glancing at Audrey, she immediately scooped up the child and boasted, "Aya, it's all thanks to my tonics. Otherwise, how could my grandson be so plump and fair?" During pregnancy, Nigel's mom always had the nanny deliver tonics to Audrey. She didn't want to eat them, but Nigel's mom would say, "If you eat so little, what if my precious grandchild goes hungry?" As a result, she was force-fed until she gained 40 pounds, and the baby grew so large inside her that it nearly killed her on the operating table. Nigel and Nigel's mom stayed for a while, but upon hearing she needed to stay in bed for 12 more hours due to the episiotomy, they prepared to leave. It was the same in the previous life. Back then, Audrey had wanted someone to stay, pleading desperately, but in this life, she didn't wish to say another word. 5 days later, Audrey was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. Nigel came to pick her up, helping her out of bed. Audrey, her legs trembled like a sieve. The slightest movement caused postpartum lochia to flow out, emitting a foul odor. Seeing Audrey's disheveled state, Nigel frowned imperceptibly. It was subtle, yet she noticed. Details she hadn't noticed in her past life now pierced Audrey's heart like needles, pricking relentlessly. Audrey was helped into the back seat by Nigel, to whom she politely said, "Thank you for your trouble." Nigel wiped his hands with an alcohol wipe, then rolled down the car window before replying coldly, "It's my duty." Audrey clenched her fists. Why hadn't she noticed this in her past life? Nigel's attitude toward her was nothing like how a husband should treat his wife who had just given birth. Although he married her, he didn't love her at all. Fortunately, in this new life, she no longer loved him either. Returning home, Audrey was helped upstairs by Nigel and returned to her room. Nigel helped her lie down, placed Merlin in the cradle beside her, and said, "I have work at the company. I'll head out first." Merlin gurgled and waved his tiny hands, trying to grab Nigel. Nigel showed no emotion, withdrew his hand, and left without looking back. In her past life, Audrey had thought Nigel simply didn't like children. Now she understood clearly it was because Nigel didn't love her, which was why he wasn't affectionate toward Merlin either. Yet strangely, Merlin always clung to him. Whenever he could speak, he would always say, "Daddy, hold me." But to Audrey, he would say, "No mommy, mommy isn't pretty." At night, Audrey was awakened by the heat. Postpartum night sweats were perfectly normal, and every time she woke up, she was drenched in sweat. In her past life, Audrey relied heavily on Nigel and often asked him to wipe the sweat off for her. Nigel complied, but judging by his stern expression, he wasn't happy about it. But in this life, Audrey didn't want to trouble him anymore. Audrey got out of bed. Supporting her waist as she went to fetch a towel to wipe the sweat from her body, Nigel watched her for a long moment, then said unprecedentedly, "Let me help you. Go back and lie down." Audrey was utterly astonished as Nigel approached with a towel and began gently wiping her sweat. "Is the pressure okay?" Nigel rarely showed such consideration, always giving her a fleeting illusion of tenderness. Audrey paused briefly before shaking her head. "It doesn't hurt." But when she looked down, she saw Nigel frowning at the stretch marks and scars on her belly. Audrey suddenly snapped out of her daze. She instinctively grabbed the blanket to cover her stomach. "No need, I'll do it myself." Nigel nodded but insisted on finishing wiping her body for her. In the middle of the night, Merlin burst into loud wails once again. Audrey was abruptly awakened, her head throbbing as if pierced by needles, yet she had no choice but to lift Merlin from the cradle, feeding him and patting his back. Nigel was also roused, looking thoroughly exasperated. Audrey finally managed to soothe Merlin to sleep and gently placed him back in the cradle. She sighed and said to Nigel, "Let's hire a maternity nurse. I don't have the energy to handle this alone." Nigel immediately agreed. All right. However, the next day, Nigel's mom somehow got wind of the news about hiring a maternity nurse and rushed straight to their home. "No hiring a maternity nurse. How could we let an outsider take care of my precious grandson? If his own mother can't handle it, then give him to me, I'll raise him myself." In the previous life, Nigel's mom had also wanted to take the child away. Audrey had refused, and after a long struggle, she managed to keep the child by her side. Audrey thus had a serious falling out with Nigel's mom. It was precisely because of this that Nigel's mom got the opportunity to drive a wedge between her and Merlin. Merlin said when he grew older, "Why didn't you let me live with Grandma when I was little? If Grandma had raised me, I definitely wouldn't be like this now." Thinking of this, Audrey readily agreed. "Fine, you take him to raise then." Nigel gave her an unexpectedly surprised look. Coming to his senses, he instinctively refused Nigel's mom. "No, the child must stay at home. Breastfeeding is better for the baby." Audrey turned to look at him. So Nigel also didn't want Nigel's mom to take the child away, yet in their past life he had let her argue with Nigel's mom alone. Nigel refused them all. Nigel's mom could only leave in frustration. In the afternoon, the maternity nurse arrived for duty. With the maternity nurse's help, Audrey finally had time to properly clean herself up. At dinner time, someone rang the doorbell. Audrey froze the moment she opened the door. Standing outside was Charlotte. She wore an elegant Chansor-style dress. Her features gentle and her figure tall and slender. Seeing Audrey, she lifted what she was carrying and said, "Audrey, I heard you've had your baby. I'm here on behalf of the dance troupe to congratulate you." Audrey felt an unexpected pang upon seeing Charlotte for the first time in this life. Strangely, it hurt more than seeing Nigel. Ironically, Charlotte had been Audrey's close colleague in the ballet company. She'd even invited Charlotte over for dinner many times during her pregnancy. Yet Audrey never knew that Charlotte was Nigel's unforgettable first love. These two men had her completely wrapped around their fingers. Audrey only paused for a moment before inviting Charlotte in, her smile as usual. "Thank you, Charlotte, stay for dinner." Nigel emerged from the study, and upon seeing Charlotte, his expression was unreadable. Audrey noticed his unusual demeanor but maintained her smile as she introduced, "Charlotte, my colleague, she's been here a few times before." "You've met her?" Nigel gave a slight nod without even shaking hands, as if they were two perfectly innocent strangers. After the meal, Audrey went with the maternity nurse to the room to breastfeed Merlin. Merlin kept crying and fussing, and nothing seemed to help. The maternity nurse said the baby might be missing his father. So Audrey handed the baby to the nurse and went downstairs to find Nigel. The living room was empty. Only when she stepped into the courtyard did she find Nigel standing with Charlotte. Audrey heard Nigel saying, "What are you doing here?" And Charlotte's voice was low. "I heard she had your child, so I came to see. The child looks a lot like her." Nigel chuckled softly. "Of course the child looks like her. She's the mother." Charlotte also smiled. Teasing, "Tell me, don't women who've had children have more charm?" Nigel gave a slight scoff. "You've seen her in this state. And you can still ask something like that." Audrey froze. Her in this state, her appearance pale as a ghost, with dry skin and a bloated body. She was the very picture of a haggard housewife. All of this was gained after having Nigel's child. Audrey's face drained of color bit by bit. Then she heard Charlotte ask, "Nigel, what if it were me who bore your child?" Nigel remained silent for a moment before saying, "You're different. How could she compare to you?" Audrey suddenly found it hard to breathe. Whether in her past life or this one, she, the wife who bore his child, could never measure up to Charlotte. So, Nigel hadn't rekindled old flames with Charlotte. He had never let her go in the first place, nor had he ever made room for her. Audrey took a step back, intending to leave. Nigel, however, keenly sensed her presence and looked over with sharp eyes. "Who's there?" Audrey decided not to hide anymore and greeted them openly. "What a coincidence. You're here too. I just came out for a walk." Charlotte, however, deliberately put on a guilty face, as if caught red-handed. "Audrey, don't misunderstand. I was about to leave and just happened to run into Mr. Nigel and we exchanged a few words." Audrey raised an eyebrow and, granting her wish, looked directly at Nigel and asked, "Is that true?" Nigel's voice, however, was calm and unruffled. It was quite a coincidence. Charlotte, seeing this, truly couldn't maintain her composure. She quickly said a few words and left. "Audrey, when you return to the dance troupe, we'll have a proper get-together. I'm leaving now." Everyone had long gone, but Nigel was still looking in the direction Charlotte had left. Audrey noticed this and softly said, "You seem to have a special regard for Charlotte." Nigel withdrew his gaze, furrowed his brows, and reprimanded her. "Audrey, I understand you're sensitive after pregnancy. But don't say things that could cause trouble for others." Audrey gave him a deep look. His righteous demeanor made her momentarily unsure if he had rekindled any feelings for Charlotte. Pushing her thoughts aside, she walked on her own. "Merlin misses you. He's been crying a lot just now. Go take care of him." Nigel frowned and called out to her, "What about you? Aren't you coming in?" Audrey didn't look back. "I'm going for a walk." Actually, she was going to postnatal yoga. Even simple stretches made Audrey break out in a cold sweat from the pain, but she still persevered. She also called the dance troupe leader and told her that she would be rejoining the troupe in a few days. After finishing these tasks, Audrey returned to the room where Nigel was holding Merlin. The man was busy with official duties. Holding documents in one hand and the child in the other, a mature man caring for a child should have been a pleasing sight. But Merlin was crying, and Nigel was comforting him with utter indifference. Audrey watched speechlessly before taking Merlin from Nigel's hands. Merlin finally quieted down as she nursed. However, her breast milk was insufficient, and Merlin sucked so hard that it made her nipples sore. In this life, she had no intention of exclusively breastfeeding, so she said, "I don't have much milk, so mixed feeding would be more suitable. Then I can gradually wean her off breast milk and feed her formula." Nigel looked at the document and said indifferently, "Exclusive breastfeeding can boost a child's immunity. If you don't have enough milk, find a way to get more." Audrey said nothing more. Early the next morning, Audrey broke out in large patches of red rashes. She knew it all too well, another bout of acute urticaria. She'd suffered from chronic hives before pregnancy. The baby had come unexpectedly, leaving no time for proper recovery. During pregnancy, the allergic symptoms became even more severe. During severe flare-ups, she scratched several patches of skin raw and couldn't sleep a wink throughout the night. Nigel immediately took Audrey to the hospital. The doctor examined the blood test results with a grave expression. "The condition is quite serious. I recommend prednisone treatment. But it's a hormonal medication. You'll need to pause breastfeeding after taking it." Nigel frowned and asked first, "Are there any other treatment options?" During pregnancy, Audrey had several severe episodes of acute urticaria as well, but she refused hormone treatment, fearing it might affect the fetus's health, because in her previous life, she believed the child was a gift from heaven, and she was willing to endure any suffering for it. After being reborn, Audrey realized that in this world, only oneself truly matters. The doctor said, "There is one, but it works very slowly." Audrey suddenly interrupted, "Doctor, I want to use prednisone." Nigel immediately turned to look at her, his eyes warning. No, didn't you hear we need to stop breastfeeding? Audrey looked at him calmly. Then what should we do? Nigel hadn't expected this reaction from her and raised his eyebrows. Wouldn't topical medication work, just like when you were pregnant? His matter-of-fact attitude sent a chill through Audrey's blood. That very night, Audrey took prednisone. She prepared formula milk and fed it to Merlin. Nigel saw the formula milk and noticed the prednisone Audrey had placed on the table. His expression turned cold, but he said nothing, and afterward, the two began a cold war. Audrey didn't care. A few mornings later, she was ready to report to the dance troupe. She tidied up and went to the door. Nigel still sat at the dining table, not even lifting his eyelids as he spoke. I've already informed your dance troupe. You're withdrawing from today onward. Audrey stood frozen in the doorway, as if struck by lightning. In her past life, Audrey suffered from postpartum anxiety, her nerves constantly on edge, unable to bear being apart from her child. She naturally never returned to the dance troupe. Audrey steadied her emotions and gritted her teeth as she looked at Nigel, saying, "You can't make decisions for me like this." She knew Nigel was displeased with her for taking the initiative to feed Merlin with formula. Nigel wiped his mouth leisurely and said calmly, "You are now Mrs. Green. No need to expose yourself on stage." Upon hearing his words, Audrey was reminded of the news she saw in her past life, how Nigel and Charlotte, after their marriage, had lavished fortunes to elevate her as the star dancer. Without waiting for Nigel's reaction, Audrey headed straight out to the dance company. The company director, who had been her mentor when she first started, was delighted to see her. "Audrey, I knew you wouldn't stay away. Our company will soon begin auditions for the lead role in the new ballet Gazelle. You Les Willis. This part is perfect for you. Do you think your body can recover to its former condition?" Audrey was also pleasantly surprised and immediately affirmed, "I can do it." Her rehabilitation had never stopped due to pain, and this time upon returning, she even planned to intensify her rehabilitation efforts. Could any pain compare to that of her past life? Upon returning home, Audrey saw her father and Nigel coming down from upstairs. The two were conversing. Mr. Lawrence appeared quite polite and ingratiating toward Nigel. Audrey was the first to greet him. "Dad." Nigel looked at her but remained silent. Meanwhile, Mr. Lawrence scolded Audrey as soon as he saw her. "I happened to have business to discuss with Nigel and thought I'd check on you. Only to find you running around outside right after giving birth." At the time of the marriage alliance, the Lawrence family and the Green family were originally of equal status. In recent years, Nigel's business has grown larger and larger, while the Audrey family's assets have been on the decline, making Mr. Lawrence increasingly dependent on Nigel's favor. Because of this, Audrey's love for Nigel in her past life was tinged with a hint of ingratiation. Later, when Audrey was divorced, Nigel used a single business deal to pressure Mr. Lawrence into forcing Audrey to sign a divorce agreement that left her with nothing. Coming to her senses, Audrey smiled indifferently. "Thanks to this deal, otherwise I wouldn't have seen you even a month after giving birth." Mr. Lawrence was taken aback. "There's just too much going on. Must you nitpick over such trivial matters?" Nigel found his gaze involuntarily fixed on Audrey, surprised by her sudden sharpness. Audrey remained composed as ever. "Of course, I know you're all very busy, so I won't trouble you busy people to concern yourselves with my affairs anymore." Mr. Lawrence was so furious that he said to Nigel, "Nigel, it's my fault for not raising my daughter properly. I've caused you trouble." With that, he left, barely maintaining his dignity. Only Nigel and Audrey remained standing opposite each other in the vast villa. Audrey silently watched Nigel, guessing what he would say to lecture her this time. To her surprise, Nigel said, "It seems you really love dancing. If that's the case, go ahead if you want to." Audrey was taken aback. She opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. That very day, she began reviewing ballet again. The villa had a dedicated dance studio, which Nigel had specially renovated and built for her when they first got married. Even the dance shoes on her feet were custom-made by professionals at Nigel's request. In her past life, it was Nigel's thoughtfulness like this that made Audrey believe he had feelings for her. Audrey sighed, putting these thoughts aside as she immersed herself in practice. After completing a series of 20 fouette turns, Audrey had just steadied herself when she heard a voice behind her. "You danced beautifully." Nigel had arrived unnoticed, standing by the dance studio's back door. Audrey paused for a moment but didn't turn around. She looked at him in the mirror, neither humble nor pushy, and said, "Thank you. On the day of the lead role audition, you can come as family." Nigel raised an eyebrow and retorted, "You're auditioning for the lead role." As he spoke, he gave Audrey's not yet fully recovered figure a once-over. Audrey's heart gave a sharp pang. Soon, she smiled composedly. "Yes. It's still competing with Charlotte." Nigel startled, then thoughtfully met Audrey's gaze in the mirror and chuckled lightly. "All right, Then do your best. That evening, Audrey sat on the bed only to discover Charlotte had posted a moment, "Thank you for the gift." The accompanying image was an exquisite statue depicting a classic pose from the ballet Gazelle, OU Les Willis, along with a luxurious gold-embossed greeting card, "Go get em, my leading lady." Audrey recognized it as Nigel's handwriting. Audrey's eyes stung as if pricked. She flexed her fingers and scrolled down to the comments below. A colleague from the dance troupe commented, "Is this Charlotte's boyfriend? So romantic." Charlotte replied, "Don't get the wrong idea, we're just friends for now." For now. Audrey wondered, what does this mean? The beginning of rekindled old flames. She let out a breath, put down her phone, stood up, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her gaze gradually firming. On the day of the audition for the lead role in Gazelle, OU Les Willis, it was also Audrey's official return to work. When she arrived at the dance company, she noticed Nigel had also come. It's quite amusing that despite being a married couple, they still arrived separately at the same place. These days, apart from sharing a bed at night, they had barely seen each other. Audrey had changed significantly, her complexion fairer, her figure slimmer. Radiating a refreshing kind of beauty, Nigel couldn't help but steal a few more glances at her and remarked, "You've prepared quite thoroughly." Audrey was reminded of Charlotte's social media post. She couldn't help saying, "I didn't expect you could really make time for this. That's very thoughtful of you." Nigel raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, a colleague came over to chat. "Audrey, is this your husband? He's so handsome. You two make such a perfect couple." Nigel put his arm around Audrey's shoulders. "Hello, Audrey just got back. We'll be counting on your care and support." Audrey also wore a faint smile on her face, a facade that Nigel had always been good at maintaining, but as her gaze shifted, Audrey caught sight of Charlotte's slightly despondent expression. In that moment, it all became clear to her, this time, along with Charlotte's previous visit when Nigel had reacted coldly. Nigel's intention was simply to observe Charlotte's reaction and gauge his own standing in Charlotte's heart. Understanding this, Audrey felt the last trace of warmth in her heart completely fade away. The campaign soon began. First, Charlotte took the stage, dancing beautifully as always. Audrey couldn't help but glance at Nigel, only to find the man staring intently at Charlotte on stage, utterly absorbed. As the performance ended, everyone began discussing, saying this time it was definitely Charlotte who would be chosen. Audrey paid no attention and stepped onto the stage with composure. The moment she began, her entire demeanor transformed, every gesture fluid or melancholic, as if she had become the character itself. When she finished, the audience erupted in continuous applause, exclaiming that this didn't feel like an audition but rather a full-fledged performance. Finally, the director announced Audrey had won by an overwhelming vote and would play the lead role. Charlotte forced back tears, clapped with a smile, then ran off crying. In the blink of an eye, Nigel from the audience seats chased after her. Audrey exchanged a few pleasantries with the well-wishers crowding around, then followed as well. "Nigel, do you hate me so much for choosing dance over you back then?" Hearing Charlotte's tearful question, Audrey abruptly stopped in her tracks. After a moment, Nigel's voice responded, "I don't hate you." Charlotte couldn't understand. "Then why did you marry Audrey, who's a dancer just like me? Wasn't it just to hurt me?" Nigel spoke in a deep voice. "Because I can't bear to part with you." Audrey was stunned, unable to comprehend it for a moment. She couldn't help but step forward, only to see Nigel and Charlotte gazing quietly at each other. His eyes filled with tenderness. In her past life, Audrey and Nigel had been married for 7 years. Yet she had never seen this gentle side of him. Speaking of which, the first time she saw Nigel was at an arranged marriage ball. He was the most striking presence at the ball, yet cold and sharp, making her want to look but afraid to stare. At the ball, Nigel came to her rescue. His effortless grace and handsome features effortlessly drew her in. Later, when he said he needed a wife, Audrey agreed to his proposal without a second thought. Yet before her eyes, Nigel said to another woman, "Her silhouette resembles yours, that's the only reason I married her." Audrey felt suffocated. What she had mistaken for love at first sight turned out to be nothing but a laughable case of mistaken identity. Audrey couldn't bear to watch any longer and walked away immediately. Before long, Audrey saw Charlotte return in a hurry, her face flushed crimson. Meanwhile, Nigel had already returned to his seat below the stage, still composed and unruffled. Audrey forced herself to stop dwelling on these matters. To catch up as quickly as possible, she planned to stay behind after rehearsal to continue practicing. Result: Nigel stepped forward. "Let's go home. Merlin is still waiting for you to take care of him," a colleague nearby said enviously. "Audrey, your husband is so considerate. Worried you might have an accident on your first day back at work. He's been waiting for you down there the whole time." Audrey could only force a smile and nod. As the two stepped out the door, they noticed it was raining outside. Charlotte stood at the entrance, apparently trying to hail a cab. Nigel's footsteps suddenly came to a halt. Audrey glanced at him before he nonchalantly prepared to leave. Just then, a child suddenly dashed out, like a little cannonball. He sent Charlotte stumbling, and she fell into the rainwater. Audrey hadn't even processed what happened when a panicked cry rang out beside her. "Ayuan!" Nigel charged forward without hesitation, leaving only a hurried remark for Audrey. "I'm taking her to the hospital first." He scooped up Charlotte in his arms and rushed into the car. The shift happened too quickly. Audrey stood frozen in place, and by the time she snapped out of it, the car was already long gone. The rain continued to pour as if determined to wash the entire world clean. Audrey walked into the rain and took a taxi home by herself. After arriving home, she first took cold medicine, then practiced dancing, and as usual, applied scar removal cream to herself. The scar from her side incision on her stomach had faded slightly, but it was still quite noticeable. Halfway through applying the medicine, Nigel returned. Audrey heard the movement but didn't look up. Nigel, however, walked over to her and silently took the cotton swab from her hand. His action startled Audrey. Nigel lowered his eyes, applying the medicine for her very carefully and gently. Audrey lay on her side, too exhausted to speak. After applying the medicine, Nigel asked, "When will this scar heal?" Audrey closed her eyes and whispered, "It might stay forever. Just like someone unforgettable who lingers in your heart for a lifetime." Nigel frowned slightly and replied indifferently, "I don't know what you're talking about. Get some rest." The next day, Nigel went on a business trip. And in the dance troupe, Charlotte also took leave. Then, within just a couple of days, Merlin suddenly fell ill. Audrey had no choice but to take time off from her busy schedule and take turns with the maternity nurse to care for the child. Nigel's mom found out and immediately rushed over to scold her. "I told you, if you can't breastfeed, fine. But you don't even take proper care of him, always stuck in that shabby dance studio or that lousy dance troupe. I really don't know how you can call yourself a mother." Audrey could only say, "It's perfectly normal for children to get sick." Having already returned home, Nigel casually remarked, "Without breastfeeding, the child's immunity will be weaker." These past few days, Audrey had been running around the hospital all by herself while Nigel was busy dating, and now he actually had the nerve to criticize her. Audrey felt a lump of anger rise in her chest. After a long pause, she finally spoke coldly. "I have to dance. There's no way I'm giving it up." The next day, as soon as she arrived at the dance company, she heard her colleagues buzzing about how a deep-pocketed Mr. Nigel had invested in the company's new production of The Nutcracker. Charlotte was also handpicked Charlotte to be the female lead. Audrey listened in a daze. The dance troupe didn't know who Mr. Nigel was, but she did. This Mr. Nigel was none other than her own husband, in her past life. Nigel had also spared no effort in supporting Charlotte. He supported her secretly before marriage, and openly after marriage. And what about her? In her previous life, she had voluntarily given up her career and dreams, only to realize in this life that Nigel never thought she should have a career or dreams in the first place. With 2 dance productions suddenly in the troupe, the casting process began immediately, as Audrey had expected. The vast majority of the troupe chose to be Charlotte's backup dancers. After all, with the financial backing of the big boss, it didn't take a genius to figure out which production had more promise, but due to the number of people, the other half still had to stay with Audrey. While in the restroom, Audrey overheard her team members gossiping. "Audrey has taken leave before to care for her child. Who knows if the rehearsals can even proceed? I really have no confidence." Sigh. "Charlotte has such a bright future now. It's just a pity we didn't ride the wave of opportunity and got stuck in Audrey's team." Audrey leaned silently against the door panel, listening. After that, she trained even harder, striving for nothing less than perfection in her movements. She came home late every day. Nigel remained as indifferent as before. After half a month of this, the troupe leader suddenly approached Audrey, his tone urgent. "Audrey, Mr. Nigel has demanded that your dance drama be cancelled. All theatre slots have been allocated to the Nutcracker." Audrey stood frozen in shock, her mind buzzing. Nigel was willing to go this far, all for Charlotte. Yet on second thought, she wasn't entirely surprised. This way, he could both help Charlotte and undermine her. But Gazelle, Les Willis wasn't just her labor of love, it was the collective effort of everyone involved in the ballet. How could all that hard work be wasted because of Nigel? Audrey gradually calmed down. "I understand, teacher. I'll do my best to resolve it." She clenched her fists and turned to leave without another word. Just as she stepped out of the dance studio, Audrey spotted the furious Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence blocked her path immediately, his voice sharp with command. "Audrey, you're forbidden from dancing from now on. Look at you, already married yet still fooling around with these things." Audrey suddenly remembered that around this time in her past life, Mr. Lawrence's company was facing a cash flow crisis, and the fact that he had spared time from his busy schedule to come and scold her must have been due to pressure from Nigel. Audrey couldn't help but sneer. "Dad, you'd better worry more about yourself, at your age, relying on Nigel whenever the company hits a snick. How shameful is that? How dare you speak to your father like that, Mr. Lawrence seethed with rage and raised his hand to strike Audrey, but she blocked the slap just before it landed. Mr. Lawrence fumed. "You Audrey, you've really grown too bold for your own good." Audrey remained unmoved. "If you dare hit me, do you really think things with Nigel will go any smoother?" Mr. Lawrence froze, and Audrey seized the moment to shove him aside before walking away without a backward glance. She went straight to Nigel's company. Ignoring the assistant's attempts to stop her, she pushed open the door to the CEO's office. The next moment, her furious footsteps froze. There on the sofa, Charlotte was sitting blushing on Nigel's lap, tugging at his tie. What was about to happen next needed no explanation. The loud commotion at the door made both of them turn their heads toward Audrey. Audrey snapped back to reality and curled her lips slightly. "Seems I've interrupted you." Nigel's expression instantly cooled. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte stepped back, offering an explanation while her face wore a triumphant smile. "Audrey, don't misunderstand. I came to thank Nigel for his investment in our dance troupe's production of The Nutcracker." "I'm not mistaken." Audrey couldn't be bothered with her. "I have something to discuss with my husband. Do you want to stay and listen too?" Charlotte was about to leave when Nigel suddenly grabbed her arm. Nigel, as composed as ever, placed a box in Charlotte's hand. "Don't forget the necklace. Remember to wear it on the day of the performance." Charlotte glanced at Audrey, accepted it with a smile. "Thank you, Tilda, Mr. Nigel." Audrey tried not to care, but the tight grip of her hand stung sharply. Once the door closed, the office fell silent. Audrey coldly demanded, "Nigel, why did you do this with the performance?" Nigel looked at her and said indifferently, "You're the one who lacks boundaries." "I lack boundaries," Audrey repeated, then asked curiously, "What about the Lawrence family matter? Why did you have my father contact me?" Nigel lifted his eyelids to glance at her sideways. "If your Lawrence family wants my help, you'll have to offer something in return, won't you? As the Lawrence family's daughter, you're the only bargaining chip available." "My value? What value?" Audrey grew even more perplexed. Nigel spoke with a detached tone, yet his words carried imperial weight. "Managing the household and raising children, that is your worth. Just listen to that." Her value, it seemed, lay solely in unconditional devotion to the Lawrence family and Nigel. Audrey felt an invisible noose tightening around her heart, yet her voice emerged eerily calm. "Then what about Charlotte? Why did you help her?" "Mr. Nigel." Nigel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Our family matters don't need to involve Charlotte." Audrey finally laughed. "Our family? Have you ever treated me as family? As your wife, or just as someone else's substitute? Fine then, let's get divorced. You won't have to stoop to teaching this disobedient substitute doll anymore." The office fell silent the moment these words were spoken. Soon, Nigel narrowed his eyes as he studied her. "You've really become quite different from before." Audrey maintained her smile. "Thanks to your guidance these past days, I've finally stopped being love-struck. How does that saying go? The less you love, the quicker the mind." Nigel frowned momentarily. He looked displeasedly at Audrey for a few seconds before saying, "As Mrs. Green, you still have value. I have no such plans for now, though of course, for the time being, you can only remain Mrs. Green." Audrey's heart sank. She wanted to say something, but her phone suddenly rang. When the call connected, it was one of her fellow backup dancers. "Sorry, Audrey, but I'm joining Charlotte's group now." Audrey felt her breath catch, but she could only agree. After that, the phone calls about members switching groups came one after another. Audrey had grown numb to it all. In the end, nearly all the backup dancers had left, and her gazelle, "OU Les Willis," could no longer be performed. Audrey put down her phone and noticed Nigel watching her with calm amusement. A surge of anger rose in her chest as she clenched her fists and demanded, "Was this your doing too?" Nigel curled his lips in a cold and arrogant manner. "Who wouldn't want to strive for a better future? Everyone can chase their future, but she's the exception." Audrey knew there was no reasoning with Nigel anymore. Without another word, she stood up and left. A few days later came the premiere of The Nutcracker. Audrey went to see it. Nigel was also there, sitting steadily in the front row. The stage design was quite elaborate. In the second act, Charlotte won a round of applause with a spiraling backbend, shining brilliantly on stage. After a final grand leap perfectly landed, the dance drama concluded, and Charlotte took a bow with the ensemble of dancers for the curtain call. Audrey watched, her hands involuntarily clenching. Her emotions were complex, not quite jealousy, but an overwhelming sense of frustration. Even in this second chance at life, was she still destined to be kept off the stage? Amid thunderous applause, Nigel took a large bouquet of roses from his assistant and gracefully stepped onto the stage. Presenting them to Charlotte, the surrounding shutter sounds immediately intensified. Audrey didn't look back, quietly slipping away. In stark contrast to the lively theater, the streets were desolate and silent. There was no need to look deliberately. The large screen outside the theater displayed a dazzling poster of Charlotte as the lead in The Nutcracker. Just then, a notification popped up on Audrey's phone. The premiere of The Nutcracker, starring Charlotte, was a triumph. Investor Mr. Nigel presented a bouquet of passionate roses. The picture shows a photo of the two together, Charlotte wearing a performance costume, beaming as she holds flowers, with Nigel standing beside her in a tailored suit, just as she had witnessed moments ago. They made such a perfect pair it was blinding. Just like in her past life, shortly after Nigel divorced her, when she saw their wedding announcement in that cramped old apartment. Audrey looked at her phone and smiled self-deprecatingly. A surprised voice suddenly rang out. "You're Audrey, aren't you? I never expected to meet you here." Audrey turned her head in confusion. To her surprise, the approaching figure was a foreign woman who immediately grasped Audrey's hand and began introducing herself. "Hello, I'm Maria, an intern manager with the Russian Royal Ballet. I'm preparing a 6-month world tour and would like to invite you as a guest principal performer for Swan Lake." Audrey froze in shock. She recognized this person. Within 2 years, Maria would become the most renowned administrative director of the Royal Ballet. Seeing Audrey frozen in hesitation, Maria hurriedly explained, "This is my business card. I'm not a bad person. Please don't distrust me. Though I'm not famous now, my name is listed on our dance troupe's official website." A sudden wave of joy, like finding a village beyond willows and flowers, swept over Audrey. Without waiting for Maria to finish, she agreed without hesitation. "I'd love to join. I could even leave today." Maria was even more delighted. "So soon? Then I'll book you the earliest available flight right now." Audrey subconsciously smiled, but the corners of her mouth quickly drooped again. "Thank you, but I need to go home first to pack some things." Back home, Audrey noticed Nigel's mom was also there, cradling Merlin and cooing at him. Upon seeing her, Nigel's mom immediately taunted, "So you still remember to come back? Seems you've forgotten there's a child at home needing care, haven't you?" Before Audrey could respond, Nigel's mom bent her head to whisper to the child, "What a bad mommy. Should we just not want this mommy anymore?" Merlin gripped Nigel's mom's clothes, giggling uncontrollably. Audrey reached out to take the child. "Merlin should go to sleep now. I'll take him upstairs." As soon as she took Merlin into her arms, he immediately burst into loud wails. Nigel's mom watched Audrey with amusement. "See, Merlin smiles at everyone except his own mother, who only makes him cry." Audrey lowered her eyes without responding, simply carrying Merlin upstairs. She placed Merlin in the cradle, rocking it gently until he fell asleep. Audrey spoke softly, gazing at Merlin's peaceful sleeping face, yet her expression remained blank. So this marriage held meaning for everyone, but for her, its meaning was simply to teach her how to let go. Audrey walked to the wardrobe, about to pack a few things and leave. Just then, the bedroom door suddenly swung open. Audrey looked up and was surprised to see Nigel had returned. The man loosened his tie and spoke to her unusually. "Why didn't you wait for me to come back together?" Audrey looked at him with a cold tone. "I thought you wouldn't come back today." Nigel smiled instead, even with a hint of pride in his expression. "As long as you behave, Charlotte has something today, and so will you." Audrey was somewhat surprised, but deep down, she knew all too well this was Nigel's charity. With that thought, she forced a trace of struggle and delight onto her face before finally lowering her head obediently and nodding in submission. Nigel, seeing this, the smile on his face grew even more smug as he quickly headed into the bathroom to wash up. Audrey stood there for a while, her desire to tidy up completely gone. In the cradle, Merlin had woken up at some point and was now leaning against the edge, his round eyes watching her without a sound or fuss. Audrey felt a pang in her heart but quickly averted her gaze. Grabbing the money and documents in haste, she rushed out of the villa without a backward glance. The taxi sped toward the airport at her urging. Half an hour later, Nigel's call came through. Audrey expressionlessly hung up the call, and before the second ring could sound, she removed the SIM card and tossed it out the window. With a sharp click, something was crushed beneath the wheels, left completely behind her. Stepping out of the bathroom, Nigel felt an unusual silence in the room. The room was dark except for the warm yellow glow of the bedside lamp, quiet and still. Normally at this time, Audrey would already be preparing Merlin's formula with the maternity nurse. Children are delicate and troublesome, causing a flurry of chaos with everything they do. Nigel looked around and noticed that Audrey, who should have been in the room, was nowhere to be seen. He glanced at the cradle and saw that Merlin was unusually quiet, clinging to the cradle and staring at him with eager eyes. Nigel ignored it and sat straight down on the bed. He flipped through his phone, and soon it was time for bed, but the person who should have returned still hadn't come back. Merlin was also awake, unusually restless tonight, holding onto the railing and stepping on his own feet while babbling softly. Nigel locked his phone screen and looked at the child, asking, "Where's your mom?" Merlin tilted his head, then slightly raised his hand, pointed at the door, and let out an "ah." For no apparent reason, Nigel felt a sudden jolt in his chest that quickly subsided, leaving behind a suffocating sensation of accelerated heartbeat. Without thinking, he rushed out of the room and dashed downstairs to search around, but the living room and kitchen were both empty, utterly silent. Audrey was gone. Suddenly, there was the sound of a door opening upstairs. Nigel immediately turned and hurried up the steps, his pace unconsciously rushed. "Audrey, what kind of game are you playing?" Suppressing an inexplicable surge of anger, Nigel forcefully pushed open the bedroom door, but the person he expected to look at him in confusion was Audrey, not the nanny who had come to pick up the child. The nanny stared in surprise at Nigel, who had rushed in wearing nothing but a bathrobe. The master of this house had always been impeccably composed. So aloof it bordered on inhuman coldness. Having worked at the Green residence for nearly 2 months, this was the first time she'd seen the master of the house in such disarray. "Sir, what's wrong?" the nanny asked, pressing further when he remained silent. "Sir, have you and your wife had an argument? She just gave birth, you should be more considerate of her." Nigel snapped back to reality, raising his eyebrows in disbelief. "Haven't I been considerate enough of her?" Audrey's clothes were all made from the softest high-end fabrics he had specially ordered, her skincare products were all gentle formulations he selected, and even the groceries were the finest delivered to their home, yet Audrey herself barely ate anything but tiny portions of diet meals, treating her workout clothes like treasures. What's the point of complaining about low milk supply? With the little you're eating, it'd be strange if the milk were abundant. As an outsider, the maternity nurse saw things clearly. Nigel was quite cold toward Mrs. Green, as if they were strangers. Mrs. Green's attitude was also peculiar, though similarly distant toward Mr. Nigel. There were many moments when she seemed to hold back words. If they hadn't been sleeping in the same room, she would never have guessed they were husband and wife. The nanny stubbornly kept silent. "Forget it." Nigel frowned impatiently. "Do you know where she went?" The nanny looked at him even more bewildered. "I don't know, sir. I just finished washing up and didn't hear any movement in the house." As she spoke, Merlin, who had been quietly lying in the cradle, suddenly started crying. The nanny remained perfectly composed, immediately picking up Merlin and placing a prepared bottle of milk in his mouth while gently rocking him, soothing. "Oh, good baby, we'll go to sleep with Auntie soon." Nigel rubbed his temples with a headache. "Take Merlin to bed." The nanny obediently carried Merlin away, continuing to patiently soothe him as she walked. Nigel was rarely dazed, but he seemed to recall Audrey comforting Merlin like this. Merlin would often wail loudly in the middle of the night. Audrey, awakened by the noise, would just sigh, reach out to pick up the child, and gently soothe him with pats. Under the warm yellow light by the bed, the woman spoke softly and tenderly. Her face, though clearly weary, glowed with a uniquely maternal radiance. What had he been thinking at that time? It seems that living life this way isn't so bad after all. Suddenly, a phone call came through. Nigel jolted awake, forcing himself back to reality. It was Mr. Lawrence on the line. He answered, hearing his father-in-law's cautious voice. "Nigel, can you reach Audrey?" Nigel always felt Audrey would return, yet inexplicably resented anyone who mentioned her. It was as if everything was reminding him that she was gone. Though he couldn't pinpoint the source of this irritation at the moment, Nigel replied impatiently. "She came home briefly and went out again, no idea where. I haven't called her yet." "I see," Mr. Lawrence sighed. "I actually wanted to help persuade her for you during the day, but daughters grow up. I simply can't control her anymore. I failed to raise her properly, causing you this trouble." Nigel knew his father-in-law wore 2 faces, one before him and another before Audrey. He had never cared for pleasantries with the man, and his flattery was purely self-serving. He curtly replied, "No," and hung up the phone. Right after, Nigel immediately dialed Audrey's number. He rarely called her. No call history, no pinned contact. It took him a while to find her number in his phone. While waiting for the call to connect, Nigel pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration. He scanned the room, then checked the walk-in closet, skincare products, clothes. Everything was still there, even the suitcase remained. So where could she have gone? Out shopping? Or had she run away from home, throwing a tantrum because there were no performances? Numerous speculations swirled through Nigel's mind as he realized that Audrey had indeed been different since having the baby. Lately, She had often been so calm and distant that it felt unfamiliar, that loving gaze she used to give him, that meticulous care in daily life, he hadn't seen those in a long time. The phone rang a few times before being quickly hung up. When he called again, all he heard was the automated message, "The number you have dialed is switched off." Audrey wasn't joking this time. Nigel found it hard to accept, but the anxiety in his heart only grew more intense. He changed his clothes, casually threw on a suit jacket, and headed out the door. Inside the security room, the young security guard looked somewhat shocked at the late-night visitor, Nigel. He had seen the famous Mr. Nigel from afar a few times, always dressed in an imposing elite style that exuded an air of unapproachable distance. But now, anyone with eyes could see that Mr. Nigel's clothes didn't match, and water droplets kept rolling from his slightly disheveled black hair. A handsome face and good figure make any look pleasing to the eye, but compared to his usual self, his current appearance could be described as disheveled. However, the young security guard was very professional. Seeing Nigel's serious expression, he also straightened his face and said, "Mr. Nigel, how may I assist you?" Nigel was anxious inside but remained outwardly calm. "I'd like to check my wife's whereabouts and review surveillance footage of her appearances." The young security guard was startled by this request. "Mrs. Green is very kind. She always sends them gifts during holidays, greets them with a warm smile every time they meet, and treats them with great respect, completely different from some other arrogant wealthy people. I just saw Mrs. Green leave not long ago, and she even waved at me as she went out." The young security guard spoke while hurriedly pulling up the surveillance footage. Audrey hadn't been gone for long, so it was easy to find footage of her. Autumn had arrived, and there she stood at the intersection waiting for the bus. Wearing only a thin coat, she seemed a little cold. Hugging her shoulders and stamping her feet. "The first time we met at the ball, she was just like this." The young people's dance was clearly a matchmaking event. Audrey, with her good looks and figure, had no shortage of dance partners lining up to invite her. It was clear that her family had raised her to be naive and innocent. At her age, she still didn't understand the significance of this ball. Smiling at every man without a hint of caution, she danced several dances with others, then slipped away to the terrace in her evening gown, shivering and stamping her feet against the cold, wanting to return. I was again blocked by two ill-intentioned scoundrels. If he hadn't helped her, who knows how trapped she would have been. In the surveillance footage, Audrey's taxi arrived shortly after she called it. She bent down and disappeared from view. Nigel watched, his heart inexplicably hollow. In this moment of melancholy, he memorized the clearly illuminated license plate number. Then, immediately called the assistant and reported the license plate. "Help me track where this car is headed, and also Audrey's other movements." Back home, Nigel sat back on the bed. Only when he completely settled down did he notice the unusual restlessness burning within him. Audrey was the wife he found to deal with the old man, Merlin's mother. To him, her existence or absence made no difference. But the thought that this vast villa would no longer have her presence made Nigel feel an inexplicable emptiness and unease. What's more, he vaguely sensed that Audrey might never return, yet soon another voice in Nigel's heart countered. Audrey would surely come back. He had chosen to marry her precisely because he valued her docile and obedient nature. How could a woman, with a husband and children, just walk away like that? She was just throwing a tantrum, trying to get his attention, after all. Since having the baby, Audrey had been trying her hardest to prove her worth in other ways, hadn't she? But she shouldn't have competed with Charlotte, nor should she have stubbornly returned to dancing when Merlin was just a newborn. He was her husband and should be responsible for her personal safety, nothing more, nothing less. Nigel was logically consistent to perfection, yet still lost his sleep. The assistant didn't keep him waiting long, soon returning with Audrey's message, "Mr. Nigel. The lady boarded a flight to Moscow, Russia, not long ago with a Russian woman." These words struck like a blow to the head, completely sobering up Nigel. The assistant continued, "According to the investigation, that Russian woman is named Maria, an intern manager with the Russian Royal Ballet. Madam might have joined the troupe's tour." Nigel felt his irritation churning uncontrollably. After responding coldly, he hung up the phone. Audrey, how dare she leave? She was the quintessential woman living in an ivory tower, relying on her father at home and then her husband after marriage. Beauty, docility, and serving her husband and children were her lifelong duties. If she were to venture out like this, wouldn't she just be at others' mercy, pushed around and molded only to return in disgrace? Only Nigel didn't know that Audrey's influence over him had already begun to show. Nigel barely slept, tossing and turning until daylight. Before finally dialing Audrey's number, the abrupt shut-down tone turned into an unreachable signal. The only possibility was that she had blocked him. Audrey left without a word. without any warning, and before that, they had merely attended Charlotte's ballet performance together. Then she simply cut off all contact with home on her own. Nigel truly couldn't understand it, feeling an impulse to buy a plane ticket and fly to Russia immediately to confront her. She loved him, and had even willingly borne his child, hadn't she? How could she leave so decisively? Nigel was just about to instruct his assistant to purchase a plane ticket to personally apprehend Audrey when the assistant's message came through first. Mr. Nigel, the auditors from headquarters have arrived unexpectedly. For the next half-month, Nigel could only remain at the company to deal with the audit. During this period, Old Master, who had managed the Green family for most of his life, stumbled in an investment after retiring for over half a year, directly dumping the mess onto Nigel. What gave him even more headaches was having to deal with those business partners during the day while putting on a facade, then coming home at night to take care of the exhausting Merlin. Normally, Nigel's mom, who couldn't wait to rush home twice a day to see the child, had signed up for a seniors travel group, and the nanny had also taken leave for nearly half a month, so childcare naturally fell entirely on Nigel's shoulders. Nigel lacked experience, and the baby couldn't speak, opening its mouth only to cry. He could vent his anger at the office, but not in front of Merlin. So, Nigel could only suppress his temper while tending to his little one, feeling as if he'd exhausted 8 lifetimes worth of patience on this tiny creature. Accustomed to handling everything with ease, he was experiencing for the first time the distress of misfortunes never come singly. At first, Nigel had no idea how to care for Merlin, how to hold the baby, where to keep the necessary items. He knew none of it, and even spent ages searching for the bottle. All these things were Audrey's doing. The maternity nurse left in a hurry and didn't explain clearly, but it seemed she had been planning to leave for a while. Having already sorted and labeled everything, Nigel couldn't help but think, Audrey was also a first-time mother, and must be feeling overwhelmed. Back then, she was practically raising Merlin all by herself. Nigel forced a bitter smile. It's true that one can only truly empathize when standing in the same position. Soon, his expression shifted again, his face turning cold. Why did he keep thinking of Audrey? Why should he frequently recall an irrelevant woman who abandoned both husband and child? Similarly, Nigel also realized he was somewhat resentful, yet faintly relieved. Audrey left in a hurry, but at least the thread of marriage still tied her to him. This thought was quickly cut off by Nigel, who was accustomed to composure and refused to let himself be unsettled by a woman. But Merlin, though prone to tears, was actually quite good at providing emotional comfort. Once she had pleased him, she would smile softly at Nigel. His nose and mouth resemble Audrey's so much that Nigel couldn't help but soften at the sight, feeling it was worth taking care of him. That night, Merlin was soothed by Nigel and drowsily clung to his milk bottle. Nigel looked at his carefree expression and felt a surge of irritation, gently flicking his nose. You little rascal, you didn't cry the day your mom left, but now you cry all night to torment your dad. Merlin opened his mouth, releasing the bottle, and looked like he was about to cry again. Nigel quickly gathered him into his arms, as usual mimicking Audrey's way of gently rocking and soothing him. After a while, the fussy little one finally fell asleep. Nigel let out a sigh. Audrey has left, yet her presence permeates everything, leaving traces everywhere in life. He couldn't help but ask himself, had just 2 years of marriage given her this much influence? Autumn in Russia is colder than back home, however, with the frequent sunshine. It was dry but not too cold. Audrey had adapted quite well during her stay here for most of the month. Perhaps it was also because she rarely went out, spending most of her time immersed in the dance troupe. Audrey had mentally prepared herself for a bait-and-switch situation when she joined the dance troupe. After all, she was from a foreign land, and all she wanted was a stage where she could dance. Maria wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. She had been the principal dancer for the White Swan in both performances of Swan Lake in St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk. Aside from Maria's strong endorsement, it was also because Audrey had won the gold medal at the Prix de Lausanne International Ballet Competition at the age of 18, performing none other than the White Swan variation. On top of that, she had quite a few performances under her belt back home. So most in the company had at least heard of the name Audrey, and she integrated fairly smoothly. In the evening, the last girl in the dance studio waved goodbye to Audrey and left. Audrey stretched her legs and decided to take a short break. She had just taken a sip of water when an unfamiliar number called in. Audrey had removed her domestic SIM card and gotten a new one as soon as her plane landed. Hearing the phone ring, her heart skipped a beat. Aside from her dance company colleagues, there shouldn't be anyone else looking for her, and their calls wouldn't come from unfamiliar numbers either. There was one other possibility. Nigel's cold face flashed unexpectedly through Audrey's mind. Staring at this string of numbers, she unconsciously tightened her grip on the phone. Nigel had alarmingly extensive information channels. She feared that even in Russia, he might trace her step by step and forcibly drag her back to their home country. The call disconnected automatically but soon rang again. Audrey felt her nerves being painfully plucked by the ringing. Whether she faced it head-on or shrank back, the outcome couldn't possibly be worse than her previous life's ending. She took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Hello, may I speak to Audrey? Sorry to bother you. I'm calling from the embassy." It was just a follow-up call from the embassy. Audrey let out a sigh of relief. "You mentioned during your last registration that you'd be touring in Russia for some time. May I ask if you have plans to reside in Russia long-term?" Audrey replied softly. "I'm still considering it. I'll go handle the relevant procedures before they expire." "Alright, wish you a pleasant day." The staff member bid farewell. Audrey hung up the phone and smiled self-deprecatingly. She hadn't realized it before, but now she saw clearly how deeply Nigel had shadowed her life. Sometimes, lying in bed at night, she would suddenly be gripped by a surge of panic. After all, even if she managed to slip away, Nigel's presence still couldn't be ignored. Just because he hadn't come knocking now didn't mean he wouldn't become that ticking time bomb in the future. Moreover, the Russian Imperial Ballet's tour is no secret. She could only pray that the arrogant man wouldn't stoop to dragging her back to their homeland for a woman he didn't love. But Audrey thought again, perhaps he was equally eager to divorce her. After all, Charlotte was the one who held his heart. A few days later, the Green family's affairs were mostly settled. Nigel rarely came home early, but on this day, he saw Charlotte waiting at the gate. The woman wore an elegant Chanel-style dress. Her gaze at him both reserved and shy, her thoughts utterly transparent. Life had been so hectic that he'd forgotten how long it had been since he last saw Charlotte. Not long ago. Charlotte was still the obsession he couldn't let go of. Yet it was Audrey's shadow that kept popping up, demanding attention. Is human nature truly this fickle, only valuing what we can't have? But he wanted to build a life with Audrey. He couldn't imagine living with anyone else but her, not even Charlotte. After a moment of contemplation, Nigel steadied himself and walked toward Charlotte with his usual composure. "What brings you here?" Perhaps it was the experience of caring for a child that had softened Nigel's demeanor, creating a stark contrast to his usual aloofness, a contrast that made Charlotte's knees weak and her heart flutter even more. She had always loved this man. If old master hadn't looked down on her background back then, Nigel wouldn't have been able to defy his family. Charlotte didn't want him to lose everything by chasing love and having to start from scratch, so she took the initiative to leave. She thought that when she became more outstanding, she could return to his side openly and honorably. When she willingly left for the sake of love, how could she have imagined that Nigel would find a suitable wife? She was on good terms with her, a junior in the dance troupe. Charlotte did not answer, only saying, "Nigel, if I had been more resolute back then, the one having children with you now should have been me." She always brought up this topic. Nigel finally responded, "Yuan, have you ever thought that back then? I was willing to give up everything for you. It was me who wasn't willing," Charlotte exclaimed urgently. Nigel calmly interrupted her. "But you left without a word too. You never explained why, and it was months later that I heard from Grandpa he'd approached you." Charlotte's lips trembled slightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't want to put you in a difficult position." Nigel let out an almost imperceptible sigh. Now Charlotte couldn't quite gauge Nigel's true feelings toward her either. She lowered her eyes and fell silent. The courtyard gate opened, and the two walked inside together. As they reached the doorstep, Charlotte stretched her hand toward Nigel and said, "Let me hold Merlin. Children can't be left alone," and for the past half-month, Nigel had been taking Merlin to work with him. Nigel needed to open the door, so he handed Merlin over to Charlotte. Charlotte teased Merlin, then gave him an apologetic smile before saying, "Nigel, it feels like ages since I last saw you. I heard you've been very busy lately, and people in the circle mentioned that Audrey joined the Russian Imperial Ballet, so I thought I'd come see you." Nigel didn't respond, opening the door with an unreadable expression. "Come in." Once in the living room, Charlotte held Merlin and naturally settled onto the sofa. Merlin was quite comfortable with Charlotte, staying quietly in her arms without fuss. Nigel watched the scene expressionlessly. Feeling little emotion, he took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and asked calmly, "How about some noodles?" Charlotte paused, then lifted her face, forcing a smile. "You never stepped into the kitchen when we were together." Nigel froze momentarily. After marriage, the home-cooked meals he had the chance to eat were also prepared by Audrey. Even though there was a housekeeper, she stubbornly insisted on cooking herself, always saying, "Nigel, you have so many dinner and drinking engagements. When you finally eat at home, you must try my cooking." He couldn't be bothered to stop her, only offering a cold and sparing comment after eating, "Not bad." Then, Audrey would flash him a radiant smile. Nigel realized he was missing her again. However, Nigel quickly snapped out of it and said, I've just picked up a bit recently while taking care of Merlin. I see. Charlotte gave him an awkward smile. Then lowered her head and continued playing with Merlin. When Nigel came out with the noodles, he heard Charlotte saying to Merlin, "Sweetie, can you say mama?" Nigel frowned. He had thought before that Audrey was not the one he truly loved, nor the person he wanted to spend his life with. Perhaps Charlotte would eventually become Merlin's nominal mother. But now, deep down, he didn't want Merlin to obediently call her mom. Merlin was also dazed, babbling incoherently. Looking like he was about to cry, Charlotte remained oblivious, her expression regretful. Not talking yet, of course, it's only been 2 months, still too young to speak. She then noticed Nigel standing by the dining table and asked in confusion, "Nigel, what's wrong with you?" "Nothing." Nigel quickly walked over, took Merlin from Charlotte's arms, and gently patted his back. Merlin finally stopped fussing and settled quietly in his embrace, his subtle coldness, imperceptible to others. Charlotte understood all too well. She froze for a moment, then laughed in a poor attempt to cover it up. "Nigel, don't misunderstand. I just thought Merlin is still so young, and with his mother not around, I just wanted to." Nigel looked at her and said calmly, "That's thoughtful of you, but no, thank you." To him, this was already a rather gentle rejection, yet it made Charlotte turn pale. Clearly, she was the one who should be standing by Nigel's side. Charlotte quickly composed herself and smiled. Audrey is really something, leaving just like that, and not even caring that Merlin is still so young. Hearing her mention Audrey, Nigel frowned impatiently. Let her go if she wants. Let's see how far she can get on her own out there. He also wanted to see what kind of dream she was willing to abandon her husband and child for, and how far it would truly take her. A month later, Audrey followed the dance troupe to their final stop within Russia. Yekaterinburg, a major tourist destination in Russia, though it was called a world tour, Maria had fought and insisted that the troupe first visit several key cities within the country. This move was indeed the right one, as the performance in Yekaterinburg attracted many foreign ballet enthusiasts to purchase tickets. During the performance, Audrey stood out as a refreshingly exotic Eastern face. The soft downy hair ornaments at her temples accentuated her delicate features, while her slender yet powerful frame, clad in a pristine white swan tutu, became a strikingly beautiful sight. After all, appearing as the principal dancer of the Russian Imperial Ballet on this international grand stage was an extraordinary and remarkable event. Her exceptional professional skills added a brilliant stroke to the timeless classic Swan Lake. Praise for her flooded the internet, with professionals hailing her as a true swan not seen in a century, making her a sensation. But Audrey knew the world was never short of geniuses or hard workers. This was merely the fleeting glory brought by fame. Her lead role as the White Swan was secured only after Maria staked her entire career to vouch for her, leaving no room for complacency. Evening, in the dance studio. From the most basic bar exercises to intricate dance combinations, Audrey strives for perfection in every detail. The day after tomorrow is the official performance, and she wins up the clockwork. Audrey completed her final fouette turn as enthusiastic applause erupted in the dance studio. She froze for a moment, realizing the other girls had stopped moving at some point and were now staring at her unblinkingly. Someone came up and hugged her, saying sincerely, "Audrey, your dance moves are truly a delight to behold. Even just practicing, you make it impossible to look away." Audrey embraced her back with ease, smiling as she said, "Really? Then I owe it all to you. Your gazes are practically my stimulant." On stage, unlike in the practice room, Audrey used to be unaccustomed to being the center of her teammates' attention, but foreigners are more straightforward, often showering her with extravagant compliments, which she has grown accustomed to and can now naturally accept, even responding with a witty joke in return. Beside her, Karina cast a disdainful glance and muttered in Russian to her companion, "If it weren't for that international gold medal 4 years ago, when would she ever have the chance to show off? The role of the White Swan would never have gone to her. And that Maria, I really don't know what kind of bewitching potion she fed him. Just an intern manager, yet he dared to stake his entire career for her. Utterly foolish. Perhaps it was because of Maria." The dance troupe members were considerate and mostly used English when communicating with Audrey. Little did they know she had already studied Russian in high school, but she was happy to accept the girls' kindness and didn't bother explaining further. Audrey looked expressionlessly at Karina. Karina thought she couldn't understand, her eyes appearing innocent yet actually full of provocation and mockery. Maria had told her that Karina, this girl, relying on her talent, the favor of the troupe leader, and having an investor uncle named Anton, the biggest sponsor of the dance troupe, had always been domineering in the troupe. Originally, she thought landing the role of the White Swan was a sure thing. But then she was edged out by Audrey. It's only natural she'd be upset, and Audrey, adhering to the principle of being kind to others, tolerated the girl as much as possible, but there's a limit to everything. Especially when she openly and secretly looked down on her background. Audrey curled her lips slightly and walked calmly up to Karina. In front of the Russian woman, Audrey's height wasn't particularly impressive, but her presence was commanding, carrying an air of quiet authority. Seeing her approach, Karina flinched momentarily before stiffening her posture. What do you want? Actually, I studied Russian in high school, dear Karina. Audrey smiled with crescent eyes and said to her in fluent Russian, besides, haven't the audience responses to my performances been quite positive these past few shows? If you have any doubts, just speak up, we can discuss them together. Karina was sharp-tongued but embarrassingly thin-skinned. Amid the laughter of the girls in the dance studio, her face flushed red with anger. Don't be so full of yourself, she snapped, then stormed off in a huff, dragging her friend along. Audrey found it amusing and shook her head before starting to pack up her things. She slung her bag over her shoulder, bid farewell to the other girls in the dance studio, and prepared to head back to the hotel to rest. Audrey had been practicing from after lunch until 6 in the evening, taking only 2 5-minute breaks, her leotard soaked through with sweat countless times. Admittedly, ballet training was tedious and demanding, Audrey, yet here she felt an unprecedented sense of freedom. Having lived through 2 lifetimes, never before had she felt as real and present as she did now. The atmosphere in the dance troupe was relaxed and joyful, and the interactions with Karina could hardly be called troublesome at most. They were just playful little moments during practice. The only thing that could truly be called troublesome. Good day, Miss Audrey. A man's voice sounded behind her, calling her name with a somewhat awkward pronunciation. Audrey shrugged her shoulders. Well, speak of the devil. To be honest, she didn't know how to describe his voice, she could only make rough comparisons. She thought his voice had a metallic quality to it, a very refined, very magnificent tone, and also, quite bewitching. Audrey often wanted to ask why he didn't sing opera instead. With a voice like that, it seemed heaven-sent, but instead worked as a prop master in a ballet company. Thinking this, Audrey turned her head in response. The man behind her had strikingly handsome mixed-race features, combining the deep bone structure of a Russian with the gentle eyes and brows of an Asian, all while wearing a roguish smirk at the corner of his mouth. His hair was casually tousled, dressed in a white double-breasted shirt and black suit pants, with a couple of buttons undone to reveal firm, well-defined muscles. It wasn't that Audrey wanted to scrutinize him, it was just that everything about him stood out. Fedor gave Audrey an indescribable impression. He possessed both the rugged wildness of a beast and the refined elegance of a gentleman. Perhaps it was precisely this contradictory charm that made girls both inside and outside the dance troupe throw themselves at him one after another. Audrey put on a polite smile and greeted in Russian. Good evening, Mr. Fedor. Audrey sized up Fedor, while Fedor in turn scrutinized Audrey. The woman had cat-like eyes, bright yet cold. Her hair casually pinned up with a wooden hairpin, a few loose strands falling by her cheeks. Her slender frame was that of a classic ballet dancer's, perhaps even more delicate, with a graceful neck flowing into elegant shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost dazzlingly so, like some rare porcelain. She and his mother were entirely different people, yet she always evoked the same familiar warmth in him. After hearing Audrey's words, Fedor snapped back to attention and flashed a surprised smile. So you speak Russian? As he spoke, he walked over. He was exceptionally tall with broad shoulders. Even this simple movement made Audrey feel a sense of intrusion, yet his manners were undeniably polite and measured. Audrey stood still, trying to relax herself, and smiled at him. After all, you speak quite a bit of English, don't you? Because of his mother, Fedor not only spoke English, but also had an English name. Indeed, Fedor smiled. You're heading back to the hotel, aren't you? Allow me to escort you to the troupe's entrance. It would be my honor to walk a short distance with such a beautiful lady. Audrey had actually heard of Fedor, this handsome prop master, long before, even before they had any contact. She noticed how well he got along with all the girls in the troupe. In fact, every time she saw him, he was surrounded by women. Even when facing 7 or 8 girls at once, he remained completely at ease, effortlessly charming them with witty remarks that often left them in stitches. Yet for some reason, Fedor took an interest in her. He wasn't being impolite, but his intentions were clear, though neither party chose to pierce through that thin layer of pretense, exchanging only small talk whenever they met. Combined with his expensive attire, Audrey knew he couldn't be just a simple prop master. However, she truly had no desire to probe further and naturally didn't want him getting too close. Audrey took a sip of water, shook her head, and said, "No need, I imagine you must have plenty to attend to." Seeing Audrey avoiding him like this, Fedor revealed an intrigued smile. He didn't insist further, withdrawing his gaze as he said, "Very well, Then I wish you success in your performance the day after tomorrow. Audrey was already on the move. Without turning her head, she merely raised her hand and waved the water bottle she was holding. Thank you for your blessing. Audrey's departure. Nigel was precisely targeted by big data with a video. His finger paused on the screen, a faint premonition stirring within him. Several unfamiliar faces flashed by, and sure enough, he saw Audrey's fair, radiant face. Her attire was the quintessential white swan costume, with the plumes adorning her head shimmering with a soft luster. The performance outfit even seemed to ripple with a glimmering light as she breathed. Pure, pristine, breathtakingly beautiful. He stared at her. From head to toe, almost greedily, Audrey stood poised on the screen, her arms gently hanging, wrists slightly turned inward, as if she herself were a silent aria. The strings flowed like an undercurrent, quietly seeping in. Audrey lightly touched her toes, her body leaning forward slightly as if startled, followed by a rapid sequence of steps. Her arms rose and fell. The control from fingertips to arms was astonishing. Nigel gazed intently, almost entranced. Whether Audrey had improved further or because it had been too long since they last met, her presence on stage was particularly mesmerizing. Step by step, it was as if she was treading on his heart, making his heart beat uncontrollably, aching yet addictive. Nigel, what are you looking at? So engrossed. Someone called him, snapping him back to reality as he remembered he was still at a dinner gathering with friends. The guy teased, dude, spacing out at such an important gathering with the guys. Nigel, you can't get away without punishing yourself with 3 drinks, can you? Nigel said nothing, put away his phone, and very cooperatively picked up his glass. Just as he was about to drink, he remembered the time shortly after marrying Audrey, when he came home drunk and saw her reproachful yet caring eyes. Back then, it was the peak of his career, and the house was fully stocked with hangover remedies and sobering medicines. He didn't even have the time to pretend to be a husband to her. Yet she remained oblivious, loving him without reservation. Only 2 months had passed, but the anger he felt towards Audrey for leaving without a word, and the self-restraint he used to ignore it, had vanished at some unknown point, leaving behind only a gentle afterglow, unique to her. It was truly wonderful. Even without her by his side, she could still give him a sense of refuge. Nigel shook his head, put down his glass, and leaned back in his chair, a slightly languid expression on his face. No, my wife doesn't let me drink too much. Laughter immediately erupted from the people at the table. Oh, how rare. Why didn't we realize before that you're henpecked? Nigel just smiled, not saying a word. The conversation at the table quickly shifted to overseas orders. The clean energy investment market in Western Europe has astonishing prospects. A large company in Munich, Germany, is looking to bring in foreign investment. Nigel's business is big enough that he can definitely snap up this sweet deal. Munich, coincidentally, was the next stop for the Russian Imperial Ballet's tour, and Audrey would also be there. Nigel nodded. Yes, I'm planning on it. He must be going to look for Audrey. The performance roster in Munich had clearly been finalized, yet Audrey noticed on the bulletin board that the name of the White Swan in Swan Lake had been changed from hers to Karina. Oddly enough, the name for the Black Swan role remained blank. This outcome didn't surprise Audrey. It was simply another case of capital flexing its influence. She wanted to go and demand an explanation, to fight for it, but outside the office door, she overheard a heated argument between the dance troupe's investor, Anton's assistant, and Maria. Anton, that is, Karina's investor uncle. Maria is just a rookie, bringing back a foreign woman as the lead dancer. The assistant crossed her arms and sneered cruelly. She dares to say it and actually use it. Who's responsible if the performance flops? Can we really entrust the international face of our Russian Imperial Ballet to Audrey? Maria retorted angrily. Audrey's professional skills are beyond doubt. The online reviews speak for themselves. She absolutely possesses all the abilities and qualities required for the White Swan role. The assistant rolled her eyes dramatically. Maria, it seems your internship is regressing. If popularity could represent everything, why would we need professional dancers at all? The assistant was dead set on casting Karina as the lead White Swan in Swan Lake, deliberately distorting the argument here. Maria trembled with rage and began cursing loudly. The troupe leader played the peacemaker amid the chaos. The actress cast as the Black Swan just injured her foot. Perhaps Audrey could give it a try. Audrey knew this was her perfect moment to appear. She pushed open the office door at precisely the right moment and declared clearly, whether I gained attention through talent or mere luck with popularity, that distinction lies in the public's judgment. I will follow the dance company's arrangements. I respect the stage and every performance opportunity. So, Mr. Assistant, could you show me some respect as well? Audrey's gaze was so intense that the assistant couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. All right, let's leave it at that for now. After the discussion concluded, when Maria was alone with Audrey, she grasped Audrey's hands with ice-cold fingers. The performance in Munich is less than a week away, which also means Audrey has less than a week to relearn the steps of the Black Swan. You should know. The Black Swan's solo involves 32 fouettes. Do you really think your body can handle it? Had she not mentioned it, Audrey might have almost forgotten she'd ever had a child. She laughed dismissively, but her gaze was firm. I've lost the stage before, and I know some opportunities, if not seized, might never come again. Besides, how would I know unless I try? Do you believe in me or not? Maria, how could she not understand such cruelty? Infected by Audrey, she nodded vigorously. You're the one I scouted, of course I trust you. Maria still had things to do, so after a few pleasantries, the two quickly parted ways again. Audrey also immediately threw herself into practicing the Black Swan dance. After a series of high-intensity complex movements came the grand finale leap. Audrey attempted to hold the pose but faltered, though she managed to recover smoothly through skill and body coordination without major errors. Yet ballet demands absolute precision. A millimeter's deviation leads to a kilometer's mistake. This flaw proved fatal, Audrey thought with frustration. On the other side, Karina glanced at her smugly and said, well, after practicing the Black Swan steps so many times, why do you still dance like an ugly duckling? All that righteous talk with the director was just empty bravado. Audrey looked at her reflection in the mirror without sparing herself a single glance. Karina wasn't annoyed either and continued to provoke. Audrey, do you need me to help you correct your posture and movements? Audrey still ignored her. Before long, Karina finally found her monologue tiresome, tossed her head, and left. The others in the dance studio hesitated for a moment before following Karina in a bustling crowd. How pragmatic people can be, Audrey had long known, and she didn't mind too much. She stayed in the dance studio, practicing alone. After 32 fouette turns, her balance faltered, and she missed her mark. Audrey lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she looked up again, she met a pair of deep, subtly concerned eyes in the mirror. Fedor had been standing at the back door for who knows how long. Only when she looked his way did he ask with concern, are you all right? Audrey was slightly surprised he knew, but quickly realized something as significant as a last-minute role change must have already spread throughout the entire dance company. Her posture remained upright as she calmly replied, I'm fine, Mr. Fedor. The Black Swan's choreography is quite challenging. She didn't utter any promises about doing well, nor did she voice grand ambitions of stunning the audience. Yet this very seriousness and determination were etched into her bones. Fedor was momentarily speechless, yet couldn't help but laugh. Audrey stood strong, proud, and composed, making his concern seem almost unnecessary. At that moment, a knock came at the door. Somewhat abruptly, the assistant who reappeared no longer looked guilty, gazing down at her with superiority. Audrey, our long-term investor specifically requested your presence at dinner. Surely you don't want to become the ballet company's pariah and cost us this major investor. Fedor started to say something, but Audrey pulled him back. The man looked calm, but in reality, the muscles and veins in his wrists were taut. Audrey couldn't help but chuckle. Yet then remembered Maria's recent haggard face, and her smile faded. She thought, for her sake, Maria must have borne an even greater burden. Soon, she raised her face with a forced smile. Of course, I'll go. The assistant walked away with an air of arrogance. Fedor looked at Audrey, his face displaying a rare sternness and ferocity. Do you think I'd be afraid of some mere assistant? She sighed helplessly. But I'm just a mere dancer myself. Fedor remained silent and had no choice but to escort her all the way to the hotel entrance. At least let me wait downstairs. The man insisted in a tone that brooked no argument. This way, if you're in any danger, just call me and I'll be there immediately. Out of safety concerns, Audrey nodded in agreement. After all, whether to go or not was a matter of attitude. How she dined was entirely her personal choice. Thus, Audrey appeared gracefully in the reserved private dining room. Dressed in a flowing white gown, the setup was grand this time. It didn't seem like a meeting to resolve investment issues for the dance troupe, but rather as if there were some major arrangement. With her brought in as mere decoration, she surveyed her surroundings, yet none of the men in the room cast their gaze upon her. Seeing is believing. The newly acclaimed ballerina indeed carried an extraordinary aura. Audrey had long grown accustomed to these curious, scrutinizing, disdainful, and even lewd gazes. Her method for maintaining inner sensitivity was to become outwardly numb. With a polite smile, she took a seat beside the dance troupe's largest investor, Mr. Anton. I've heard so much about you. Audrey calmly conversed with everyone around the table before realizing that the most important guest seat remained empty. Anton was considered a prominent investor in Russia, who could command such a grand presence that these magnates would wait without complaint. Just as I was thinking, the private room door opened. Amid the restaurant waiter's respectful words, Audrey lifted her gaze. Then, she met Nigel's familiar eyes. Audrey had no time to evade. She felt as if, in an instant, Nigel had spotted her among the many people in the private room. His eyes were so deep they seemed capable of drawing one in. In all these years, Audrey had never seen another pair like them. A current seemed to course through her body, leaving her numb for a moment. Almost stopping her breath, she didn't know if it was panic or fear. The bosses in the private room rose one after another to welcome Nigel's arrival, polite greetings, or fawning flattery, such as "Mr. Nigel is young and promising and I've long admired your reputation," rose and fell in succession. Nigel handled them with grace and ease, behaving impeccably. Audrey kept her head down, trying to minimize her presence, but she felt his gaze, as if it were tangible, clinging tightly to her. Anton patted her shoulder and whispered in her ear, Audrey, why don't you say hello to Mr. Nigel?" Audrey finally looked up and met Nigel's gaze again. After being away for over 2 months, Audrey had rarely thought of him and almost believed she'd forgotten what Nigel looked like, yet upon meeting again, she found herself perfectly composed. But when she actually saw him, countless thoughts flashed through her mind, the cold indifference that forced her to sign the divorce papers. The unmoved, mocking and aloof demeanor, every Nigel from her memories overlapped with the man before her, unchanged, yet somehow different, the same in one aspect. They all repelled her. Audrey took a light breath and stood up. The boss beside her, seemingly afraid she might say something wrong and offend someone, reminded her, Audrey, this is Mr. Nigel." Audrey gave a slight nod. "Mr. Nigel, hello." Nigel never expected that the person he had been longing for would appear before him so suddenly. The moment their eyes met, Audrey's resistance was too obvious, and after that, she pretended not to see him. His longing almost materialized, turning into a fire that nearly burned through his chest. Now, she still had to be reminded by another man to stand up and reluctantly greet him. Nigel experienced, for the first time, a strong sense of possessiveness. He stared at Audrey, but his words were directed at Anton. "Mr. Anton, why is my wife by your side?" Anton never expected that at his age, he'd break into a cold sweat under the gaze of someone so much younger. He had long heard about how Nigel's wife, instead of enjoying a life of leisure, had taken up ballet. Little did he expect that his wife would be the very thorn in the side of this niece before him, Audrey. Audrey hadn't anticipated either that Nigel would say such things. Whether in past lives or this present one, he had rarely taken her to public events. She hadn't even met his friends, let alone been introduced to others as his wife. In their past life, everyone praised Nigel and Charlotte for their unforgettable first love and rekindled romance, while forgetting Audrey, who had married Nigel 7 years prior. Thinking of this, Audrey felt increasingly unsettled, her heart sour and swollen. Desperately needing an outlet to ease the discomfort, Anton wiped a non-existent cold sweat from his temple and hastily, with utmost respect, ushered Audrey to sit beside Nigel. "Mr. Nigel, please forgive my oversight. I hadn't realized Audrey was your wife." Audrey loathed this place intensely, and now it had once again thrust her into an awkward situation against her will. In fact, dealing with Nigel would prove even more unbearable than handling the group of men in the room earlier. Yet under everyone's watchful gaze, refusing to sit beside him would only make the scene spiral further out of control. Audrey had no choice but to take her seat next to Nigel. There was no physical contact between her and him, yet his aura was so overpowering that even just sitting there simply, one could feel an invasive chill. Audrey, being Nigel's wife, was exposed, and the impolite gazes in the private room all withdrew. Nigel must have taken the wrong medicine for some reason. Actually starting to serve her dishes and soup, attending to her with meticulous care, Audrey inexplicably thought of Fedor, how he and the girls performed popular memes to amuse everyone. How should that phrase go again? It should be, "No matter who you are, get off Nigel right now." Audrey smiled inexplicably and began to enjoy Nigel's service with a clear conscience. By then, everyone had started commenting on how perfectly matched she and Nigel were, though just ordinary compliments. They made Audrey, sitting beside Nigel, feel even more uneasy. Afterwards, the private room finally began buzzing with professional jargon that sounded foreign to her ears. Audrey forced a smile beside Nigel for a while before excusing herself on the pretext of feeling unwell. She walked into the hallway, took out her phone, and planned to let Fedor waiting below know she was safe. But the compartment door suddenly opened. Audrey instinctively looked over. A tall figure emerged from inside. It was Nigel. She was so surprised that she didn't immediately look away from him. In her daze, Nigel had already walked up to her and naturally placed his hand on her forehead. "Are you feeling unwell?" Audrey hadn't expected this from him. She trembled slightly and took a large step back, like a startled rabbit. Nigel thought. This was more like the Audrey he knew. Seeing the barely concealed shock and doubt in her eyes, Nigel let out a soft chuckle. So it was an act after all. You're quite the deceiver. His tone carried an intimate teasing quality Audrey had never heard before. Uncertain what Nigel was trying to say, she chose silence. Facing her aloofness, Nigel suppressed his smile and lit a cigar. Audrey, you left so resolutely. As if abandoning your family would clear a smooth path to success. Audrey looked at him expressionlessly. Nigel exhaled a puff of smoke and continued. Who would have thought that behind all the glamour? You still couldn't escape the drinking parties. Nigel, this man truly has a knack for making Audrey feel suffocated and short of breath every time they speak. In her shock and anger, she completely failed to notice Nigel's underlying resentment. She only found his sarcastic remarks unbearably grating. He tilted his head toward Audrey, the crimson glow of his cigar burning a hole through his gaze. Meeting his gaze, Audrey still wanted to retreat, but forced herself not to show weakness. How could she not know that in this dinner party, which was perfectly normal for men, her presence would turn her into an accessory? She also despised such behavior, but it wasn't her choice to become an exhibit. Nigel had frequented such gatherings, a beneficiary who was accustomed to them. So what right did he have to judge her from his high horse? Audrey was seething inside, yet her voice remained calm. Mr. Nigel. Utilizing resources and adapting to circumstances, I find nothing shameful in that. It's the same in business as it is in dance. No matter where you are, Anton is the biggest investor in our dance troupe. After all, Mr. Nigel, I was married to you for 2 years and even bore you a child, yet I never got the chance to perform in domestic theaters. If you wouldn't give it to me, why shouldn't I fight for it myself? Nigel hadn't expected Audrey to wield such influence over him. Just a few words from her had turned his composure upside down. His Adam's apple bobbed as he walked over, wanting to touch her face. It was my slip of the tongue. Don't talk about yourself like that. Audrey simply found it baffling and turned her head away. You were the one who stopped treating me as a person first. I just followed your lead, and now you're unhappy about it. Or do you consider me your possession? Where only you can criticize me while I'm not even allowed to mock myself. Nigel's hand froze mid-air. Audrey's words were as sharp as a knife. She was becoming increasingly adept at using self-deprecating tactics that wounded him deeply while costing her dearly, a classic case of mutual destruction. Clearly, he had come specifically to see her, fully prepared to give her whatever she wanted. Yet how did a single sentence from him manage to ruin the atmosphere like this? Audrey would only respond indifferently if she knew what Nigel was thinking. Because our zodiac signs clash, you're my jinx. Still, upon meeting again, she genuinely felt Nigel was acting strangely. He could be any way at all, preferably having nothing to do with her, just not like this. What way? As if deeply infatuated with her. As the shock and discomfort of their reunion faded, Audrey could only sneer when this thought surfaced. Mr. Nigel, Mrs. Green, pardon the interruption. No one knew when. Mr. Anton also emerged from the private room. Mrs. Green, I sincerely apologize for my niece's disrespect towards you. Anton feared that Nigel, being vindictive for his wife, would seize an opportunity to exclude him from their partnership. When it came to profit, he was always flexible. I can inform the dance troupe to return the Black Swan performance slot to you. As soon as she said that, Nigel immediately looked at Anton, his gaze cold. Nigel then confirmed that Audrey's appearance at the dinner was indeed due to something, and it turned out she had been temporarily replaced. No need, Mr. Anton, Audrey refused without a second thought. She wouldn't accept charity, especially not from Nigel. Besides, Anton was the one who insisted on backing Karina, yet now he's washing his hands of the matter entirely, utterly despicable. My role as the Black Swan has already been finalized by the dance company and publicly announced. As a professional dancer, I have no intention of abusing privilege to go back on my word. Her poise was impeccable, her demeanor dignified, and when her liquid eyes met yours, they carried both grace and sharpness. Anton, Mr. Nigel is an excellent businessman who values mutual benefit. There's no need to try approaching this through me, it won't work. With one sentence. He killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Anton's face was ashen, and Nigel wasn't faring much better. He knew that Audrey was still talking about the Lawrence family's financial difficulties. At that time, Nigel said that if the Lawrence family wanted his help, Audrey, as a daughter of the Lawrence family, had to offer something of value in exchange. He said that being a good wife and mother was her value. Does he still think that way now? Seems not. It's just that Nigel never expected the words he once thrust at her would now strike right between his own brows. Audrey has a heart as transparent as glass, and she holds grudges exceptionally well. He lowered his gaze to the woman beside him. She had grown thinner, her features delicate yet her eyes bright and resolute. This was a far cry from the Audrey of the past, who had always been hesitant and indecisive. At that moment, Audrey turned to look at him, her gaze open and unflinching. "Mr. Nigel, wouldn't you agree?" Nigel collected himself and replied, "Indeed, there will be further planning regarding the collaboration. There's no need for haste, Mr. Anton." Audrey was about to say something else when she heard Nigel say, "My wife isn't feeling well, I'll take her home now." Anton nodded repeatedly. Audrey and Nigel rode the elevator down together, neither speaking a word. As soon as they exited the hotel, Audrey hurriedly tried to leave. Today's dinner engagement had already disrupted her training schedule. With less than a week left before she had to perform the Black Swans dance on stage, she had no time to keep arguing with Nigel. Nigel grabbed her wrist firmly, his voice and expression dark. "I'll take you." Audrey refused without hesitation. "No need, someone's waiting for me." "Audrey." At that moment, Fedor stepped out of a car by the roadside and hurried toward Audrey. "Are you all right?" He grabbed her shoulders and examined her, only feeling relieved when he saw she was completely unharmed. Audrey smiled with a touch of helplessness. "I'm fine." A strange mixed-race man appeared out of nowhere, completely capturing Audrey's attention, and she didn't even notice that she had already exceeded a safe social distance with this person. Jealousy almost burned away Nigel's reason, and he couldn't help but tightly grasp Audrey's wrist. "Audrey, who is he?" Fedor also looked at Nigel in response, with a hint of hostility in his eyes that only they could perceive. Audrey realized that Nigel was still by her side, and at the same time, a new wave of shock washed over her. Looking back now, she realized those years of marriage with Nigel could hardly be described as intimate. They even addressed each other almost exclusively by full names, or sometimes with no address at all. "There's no need for you to know this." Nigel kept his grip on her wrist, the corner of his mouth curling into a cold smirk. "Really? Then we can still talk about our marriage." Fedor's appearance had created a sense of crisis for Nigel, and Audrey knew it well, but she didn't want to discuss it with him now. The two of them were in a foreign country, and there was no way to get a divorce. Talking about such things would only waste time and entanglement. Besides, facing Nigel, she was filled with resistance from head to toe. "Let's discuss this matter when we have the chance. I need to leave now." Nigel was almost amused to the point of laughter by her. "She doesn't want to talk about this with you. Sir, please let go." Fedor's words were polite, but his hand applied a slight, skillful force, separating Nigel's and Audrey's hands. Nigel was caught off guard, while Audrey was quickly ushered into the car by Fedor. "Audrey," he called out to her, but she didn't even spare him a glance. At this moment, Nigel clearly felt the joy of recovery that had just filled his entire being turned into a pain that quickly seeped into his very core. Only after merging into traffic did Audrey break the silence in the car. "Fedor, please forgive my concealment, for dragging you into the matters between me and my husband, causing unnecessary misunderstandings. It was not a pleasant experience, which is why I've never mentioned it to anyone." Fedor showed no surprise, driving with focus. "I could guess. Otherwise, how could she have come to Russia alone, without luggage, without any preparation?" He still remembered the first time he saw Audrey. The girls said a foreign woman had joined the dance troupe, but he didn't pay much attention. He met her the next morning at 6 in the dance studio. Audrey had just finished stretching and straightened up, her pale face catching his eye. She looked languid, clearly not fully awake, but upon seeing someone, she adopted a very friendly expression and said to him in still somewhat unfamiliar Russian, "Good morning." He returned her greeting, politely asking if she needed any help. Audrey instinctively shook her head, then quickly, a little embarrassed, asked him where there was a supermarket or mall nearby, as she was in dire need of daily necessities. After that, Fedor unconsciously started paying more attention to Audrey. Over time, he discovered that Audrey, like his mother, possessed a magical quality that could calm people just by looking at her a little longer. By the time he realized his feelings for her were different from the norm, he was already deeply entangled, unable to extricate himself. "You know," Audrey paused, then smiled again. "Right. I was a bit too nervous when I first arrived." "No," Fedor replied quickly, his voice just as quickly softening. "I never told you. My mother also left her homeland for Russia, but she did it for love. For a man who wouldn't treat her well, she wasn't prepared for anything. In fact, she knew nothing about that man or his family. As soon as I was a little older, I started urging her to divorce him. There was no need to devote her entire life to a man who didn't love her. Unfortunately, she said the property issue was too complicated. She gave birth to me and didn't want me to end up penniless." Fedor didn't know why he was saying so much. Perhaps he felt that in such an enclosed space, with only himself and Audrey present, perfect for pouring out one's heart, Audrey fell silent on her own. Fedor's mother's story made her sigh. and suddenly reminded her of Merlin, the child she had carried for 10 months. Children change every day. She wondered if she would even recognize him now. Then again, she thought she might after all, in her past life. She had watched him grow until he could run and jump. When a woman becomes a mother, she has many things to consider. Having been away for so long, she still feels deeply indebted to Merlin. Having lost her own mother at a young age, she understood all too well what it felt like to grow up without one. That's why in her past life, she had always wanted to give Merlin the most complete maternal love. But in the end, children are like blank sheets of paper, easily shaped by the outside world. In her heart, Merlin and Nigel were ultimately different. Audrey sighed. She loves you very much. Yes, Fedor said, then fell silent for a moment. So after this tour ends and we return to Russia, I'm leaving the dance company. Audrey was momentarily stunned. Fedor was one of her only 2 friends in the company, and she was both surprised and reluctant to see him go. Audrey suppressed an inexplicable ache in her heart, blinked, and said softly, "That's so sudden, but I wish you all the best." Fedor didn't look at her. "With your blessing, I think it will." After the interlude passed, Audrey threw herself back into intense practice. Due to adjustments in the cast, formal rehearsals were frequently required. To be fair, Karina danced the White Swan well, but still couldn't compare to Audrey. The company director and artistic director often sighed while watching Audrey's figure. Technically speaking, the Black Swan is in no way inferior to the White Swan. It even requires more explosive power. The classic 32 fouettes particularly test a dancer's control over their point work. Audrey's strength was too restrained, like a reserved and haughty little princess, lacking the bewitching allure that belongs to the Black Swan. Simply put, it lacks soul. But from scratch till now, her movements have become precise enough to be considered standard, reaching a level fit for the stage. It just completely fails to represent Audrey's true caliber. If Karina's White Swan scores 80 points, then Audrey's Black Swan barely reaches 75. It's actually quite normal for supporting roles to be slightly inferior to the lead, but they knew full well that this performance could have continued with a perfect White Swan. Apart from this minor disappointment, Audrey also had trouble from Karina, probably because Anton had informed Karina. Karina no longer dared to provoke her openly, but the covert mockery never ceased. Whenever Audrey finished a dance segment, she and her clique would gather to snicker quietly. When Audrey glanced over, the group would immediately fall silent. The ugly duckling in Russian Audrey was getting tired of hearing it. More than 4 days passed in a flash, and soon it was the day of the official performance. Backstage, Audrey stood at the edge, fully made up but slightly uneasy. Fedor had already set up the props on stage and hurried over to greet her. First time performing as the Black Swan. Nervous, Audrey shook her head. "I'm fine." Karina took in everything, glaring secretly at Audrey, grinding her teeth in anger. The woman dressed as a Black Swan instantly exuded a completely different aura. The black hue even harmonized with a certain innate quality about her, creating an exquisite yet melancholic allure that was impossible to look away from. Fedor, that guy, actually went out of his way to look after her. Her friend beside her noticed Karina's unusual mood and said, "Have you forgotten how she danced? She'll only embarrass herself when she goes on stage." She had actually forgotten how Audrey usually performed. On stage, only skill truly matters. Karina calmed herself, flashed a confident smile, and stepped onto the stage. Karina's White Swan garnered considerable acclaim. After the first act, the audience was more or less fatigued, and it was inevitable that their attention would wander. There were even some murmurs of conversation in the hall. As the second act began, the curtain rose, but the hall remained dim. The lively music swells from soft to intense as a spotlight falls, revealing a graceful, slender figure emerging with light dance steps. Her waist appears exquisitely slender, her long arms lifting gently as her pointed toes rise gracefully until extending overhead, after a small hop in place. She twirled her way to the center of the stage. Then, she steadied her movements with perfect control and turned her head with a smile. Beneath the Black Swan's forehead ornament was a face of delicate, cold pallor. A faint, willful smirk curled at the corners of her lips, strikingly vivid and breathtaking. Sitting in the front row, Nigel's pupils trembled as he involuntarily rose to his feet. This was Audrey on stage. Nigel wasn't unfamiliar with Audrey's dancing, at first glance. He had only felt a vague sense of beauty, pleasant but unremarkable, yet it was precisely this that made him so recently stunned by Audrey's performance as the White Swan. This time, the Black Swan seemed to suit Audrey better than the White one, carrying a striking sense of impact and tension. After her appearance, the accompaniment added drumbeats, as if the lakeside had come alive with excitement. Audrey moved with the music, enchanting and ever-changing. Tiptoeing lightly like a noble black swan emerging gracefully from the depths of the lake, Both alluring and composed, the murmurs of admiration from the audience soon turned into gasps, then fell into instant silence. Then, the black swan began to imitate the white swan's dance steps to lure the prince. Audrey dressed in a black gown, flawlessly mimicking the purity of the white swan, her movements light and her steps fresh, yet inherently seductive, utterly captivating. Even a prince as steadfast and noble became her devoted admirer. Every member of the audience was immersed, not just their gaze but even their breath held captive. In this segment, Audrey's dance steps largely overlap with Karina's. As the black swan, Audrey executes the movements with greater finesse, making it immediately apparent to the audience that the two are on entirely different levels in terms of expressiveness, and Karina watches Audrey on stage from backstage without blinking. Her chest heaving uncontrollably, she is nearly faint with anger. Audrey shows no trace of the clumsiness from rehearsals and has completely overshadowed her, the white swan, just like a black swan masquerading as a white one, effortlessly and convincingly. Karina clutched the curtain tightly, her heart burning with jealousy. With just a little more force, the props by the curtain would come crashing down, ruining Audrey's performance. Karina had barely moved when a pair of large hands, like iron clamps, silently seized hers. Her heart skipped a beat as she whirled around to see Fedor staring at her with icy eyes. Karina immediately flushed with tears. "I wasn't trying to," Fedor smirked without warmth. "The troupe leader wants you to adjust your dance steps for the stage." Karina hurried away. The performance on stage continued, the soft and soothing music fading as a soaring symphony abruptly surged forward. The prince was deceived, and the audience was also. Audrey enchanted by the black swan she portrayed. Darkness enveloped the surroundings, with only a single beam of light shining upon her head. Audrey spun rapidly, her slender arms extending gracefully along the straight axis from head to toe. In the fouette turns, she barely moved an inch, her movements swift yet controlled, hitting every beat with precision. The spectator gasped. A full 35 turns, 3 more than the traditional fouette. "That's absolutely incredible." After the fouette turns, Audrey landed steadily. The black swan, shedding its gentle facade, exuded a natural allure and sharpness, a stunning, fully realized form. Her gaze fell, eyes cold and bright, precisely spotting Nigel sitting in the front row. Nigel felt his breath stolen away by Audrey, his heart pounding like a drum. The two locked eyes in silent confrontation. The theater briefly hushed before erupting into thunderous applause. Audrey's movements were clean and sharp, truly a pleasure to behold. At the end of the ballet, the prince saw through the black swan's trick and saved the white swan. At the end of Audrey's performance, she lay weakly on the ground, her head tilted back, forming a fragile yet fluid arc. The stage lights illuminated her profile, half bright and half dim, one side an unsettling, captivating beauty, the other a rapidly fading vitality. The audience was utterly stunned by the scene before them, rising to their feet in unison and bursting into thunderous applause. Nigel, the person beside him, struck up a conversation. "That was incredible, first time I've ever felt like crying at a ballet performance." Nigel took a long moment to find his voice again. It was magnificent. He had truly been wrong before. Audrey was indeed a swan meant to soar, yet he had tried to confine her at home. It was no different than forcing her to slit her own throat. In that moment, he almost wanted to rush onto the stage and tell Audrey. He truly regretted it. The black swan was so breathtaking that when the audience saw the white swan and the prince embrace at the end, they found it rather dull. The scattered applause fell on Karina's ears like a sharp slap, a burning reminder. Her position was stolen. She couldn't even compare to Audrey's black swan. She was nothing but a clown, as she dwelled on it. The fire on Karina's face burned all the way to her heart. It's all Audrey's fault. She could dance the black swan perfectly, yet pretended to be so clumsy, to lower everyone's guard. She was such a master of deception, even fooling the troupe leader. Then, everyone took the stage, bowing for the curtain call. As the familiar black swan appeared, the audience's applause grew even more fervent. Stepping off the stage, Karina felt as though she had been stripped bare. While Audrey was once again surrounded, resuming her position as the center of attention, she couldn't accept it, and furiously stormed over to Audrey. "You did it on purpose. You just wanted to steal my thunder." After the ballet, the audience was all discussing Audrey's black swan. There was no mention of her Karina's white swan performance at all. Audrey smiled without speaking. She did have an intentional element to it, indulging in her mischievous delight of playing the fool to outwit the tiger. But ultimately, if Karina's white swan dance had been good enough, what role would there have been for her? After all, the stage is all about skill. Maria had arrived at some point, and stood beside Audrey with her arms crossed. How could that be? Focusing on oneself in the evening becomes opposing you. Speaking of which, wasn't the white swan taken by your uncle for you? if your skills aren't as good? Why are you still looking for trouble with others? Audrey didn't have time to argue with Karina. She hadn't seen Fedor since getting off the stage, which made her inexplicably uneasy. Taking advantage of Maria's presence, she slipped away from the crowd. She removed her makeup, changed her clothes, pinned up her hair with a simple wooden hairpin, and carried her costume to the props room. This time, her costume had been personally adjusted by Fedor, so it looked especially stunning on stage. By all accounts, she ought to properly thank him. However, Audrey searched the entire props room but couldn't find anyone. Her heart pounded with a sudden premonition. Audrey took out her phone and dialed Fedor's number. The receiver only delivered the cold, mechanical voice of a woman saying, "Sorry, the number you have dialed is currently switched off." Fedor seemed to have left ahead of time. His presence permeated the prop room, yet the person who brought that fragrance was gone. They had only known each other for a few months, so why did she feel such a profound sense of loss? Audrey took a deep breath, walked out, and slowly closed the door to the prop room. Looking up again, a bouquet of intensely vibrant red roses was presented before her eyes. Audrey held her breath, her heart pounding. She lifted her eyes and, through the vibrant petals, saw a familiar face. It was Nigel. Audrey let out a breath, and her whole being suddenly calmed. Nigel, who stood before her, naturally didn't miss any of her reactions. From anticipation to disappointment, it was all crystal clear. Who did she think he was, that smooth-talking Russian man? But he forcefully suppressed his anger and said in a deep voice, "Audrey, I've been waiting for you to give me an explanation in person." Audrey looked at him with some surprise. Nigel, this man, always took the initiative, only giving orders and making arrangements, never putting himself in a passive position. But this time, Audrey's heart skipped a beat. She vaguely understood what this change meant. It was just that his love, to her, had become a burden. Nigel, let's get a divorce. We'll do it as soon as we're back in China." Audrey hadn't expected Nigel to give up at all. It was as if he didn't have any official duties to attend to back home. He simply followed the dance troupe's tour flights, always sitting in the audience during her rehearsals, or sending someone to deliver a passionate bouquet of flowers after her training. However, Audrey couldn't help but recall the bouquet he personally gave to Charlotte on the day she left. Every time she saw roses, indeed, roses are passionate no matter who they're given to, she thought. Every time she received them, she would hand them over to the new prop master to be made into stage props for future use. During the official performance, Nigel would never miss a single one. Without fail, he would personally deliver a large bouquet of flowers, leaving behind numerous photos of the two together in the media, as if making up for that day, never explicitly refusing or accepting, only single-mindedly doing what serves their own purpose. Thus Nigel never brought up the matter of their marriage. Audrey also pretended not to understand his intentions, just as before, adhering to the 3-no principle. No refusal, no response, no responsibility. The Russian Imperial Ballet's 6-month tour finally came to an end. The tour lasted from mid-year to year-end, and the group returned to Russia just in time for the Christmas holidays. Maria, as the reserve administrative director of the dance troupe, dragged Audrey along to attend a ball with her. The ball was quite grand, and according to Maria, it was hosted by the renowned Slavkov family of Russia, as a century-old prestigious family. To secure sponsorship for the dance troupe, Maria said she had to pull out all the stops just to get the invitation. At the ball, Maria was busy socializing. Audrey sat in the lounge area with nothing to do. She realized Maria didn't need her at all and wondered why she had been dragged along in the first place. Rather than being stuck in such an occasion, she'd much rather be back in her dorm, making a cup of hot cocoa, watching TV, and taking a nice hot bath. The surroundings suddenly fell silent. Audrey looked up as if sensing something. A familiar figure appeared on the second floor, standing beside the head of the Slavkov family whom Audrey had just glimpsed moments ago. It was actually Fedor. The man stood impeccably dressed in a suit, his expression cold and detached as his gaze swept over the crowd without a ripple of emotion. This was completely unlike the Fedor who joked and flirted with the girls in the dance troupe. The family head announced to the crowd, "Fedor Ming Slavkov, my son, will become the family heir." The entire hall erupted in applause, with congratulatory voices rising one after another. Audrey was a bit stunned, but she joined in the applause as well, and then, the highly anticipated Fedor, step by step, descended from upstairs and slowly walked to her front. "My beautiful lady, may I have this dance?" He said this, his voice still pleasant. Audrey had no idea what expression was on her face as she placed her hand on Fedor's under the watchful eyes of the crowd. The two glided onto the dance floor. Audrey kept a smile on her face while giving the firm flesh beneath her fingers a sharp pinch. "My dear Mr. Fedor, who would have thought you had such impressive connections?" It didn't hurt much. Fedor, yet he made a pained expression, winking playfully at her. What, now that you know my true identity? You're afraid to associate with me. This made Audrey find a familiar shadow, feeling much more at ease, and joked, not at all. Please forgive my previous rudeness. Halfway through the ball, the two slipped out onto the terrace. Audrey joked, so you were in such a hurry to leave because you were inheriting the family fortune. After several dances, Audrey recalled the lingering disappointment from Fedor's sudden departure, which had been momentarily overshadowed by the earlier shock. Fedor grew serious, hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Tonight, it was for my mother, and for you." Audrey was stunned anew. "For me, yes. Last time when Anton summoned you to that dinner, I was powerless to help. It pained me deeply. Perhaps psychological confession was too embarrassing." Fedor, a slick-tongued man who loved witty remarks, became utterly flustered in her presence. Audrey admitted that this sense of achievement was truly addictive, but she reached out to cup his face. Her expression solemn, Fedor was also effortlessly stopped by her movement. Audrey said seriously, "I don't need anyone to protect me, Fedor. I just need someone to support me. Don't let anyone become a reason to shackle yourself. I won't do that, and I don't want you to become like that. Just do what you want to do, Fedor. Don't overthink it. You don't need to bear responsibilities that others haven't asked of you. Even if someone asks, you can choose to do what you truly want to do." This time, the one who was stunned was Fedor. He subconsciously grasped Audrey's hand against his face and said slowly, "I will." After returning from the Christmas holidays, there was the dance troupe celebration banquet, and after this night, Audrey would also return to the domestic dance troupe to continue her career. She had made up her mind early on. At the celebration banquet, Nigel also appeared. He seemed to be very busy lately, with no time to bother her. Only the unshakable bouquet of red roses expressing his love. Audrey never got the chance to tell Nigel that it was so tacky. Truly tacky. Today was no different. He stared at her, shared a few drinks with the troop leader, then hurried off again. He was absolutely determined to make his presence known. As the dishes were officially served, the troop leader, beaming with excitement, loudly announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, let us congratulate Maria on officially becoming the Royal Dance Troupe's executive director." Audrey, her mouth still full, couldn't help but tear up and clap vigorously. For Maria, and for herself, in her past life, she could only look up to Maria's story, gazing at the world of ballet she had once stepped into and then left behind. But in this life, she became a participant, even befriending the Maria she had only heard about in news reports, and contributed to her career. Halfway through the celebration banquet, Maria was already drunk. She hugged Audrey and sobbed, "Audrey, can't you stay? I can't even imagine life without you." Audrey was also slightly tipsy. Soon she realized something and changed her tone. "We'll definitely meet again, and now, you won't have to search specifically to find traces of me anymore." Half a year ago, Maria appeared before her, travel-worn and weary, changing her life forever. She would not be buried again. And she would never allow herself to be buried. Maria looked at her determined expression, and her tears flowed even more fiercely. "Okay, then I'll dig you up again to work for me." Karina also awkwardly shuffled over. She might have learned a sentence of English from a translator, and she said it clumsily to her. "Audrey, I will definitely surpass you." It lacked any imposing presence, but it did manage to amuse Audrey. Karina, embarrassed and angered by her laughter, stomped away in frustration. Audrey looked at the people around her, the smile never leaving her lips. Life was so good, almost unrealistically perfect. As the banquet ended, Audrey, one of the few still sober, helped the drunkards back to their respective rooms. After doing all this, for some reason, she felt like going out for a walk. The moment she stepped outside, the chilly January wind snapped her awake. In the silent breeze, a car stood quietly parked, dressed in a suit. Fedor leaned against the car, his phone just raised to his ear. Seeing Audrey, he put his phone away again, his eyes quietly watching her. Audrey heard her heart pounding like a drum. He had come for her, nothing else. Just him, with a touch of weariness and a hint of loneliness. Audrey walked over, feeling as if she were floating on clouds. Fedor looked down at her, a little pitifully. "Audrey, are you going back to your country?" Audrey wanted to lie to comfort him, but still confessed, "Yes, I've booked a flight for tomorrow." Fedor was speechless. He had prepared a lot of excuses today, wanting her to stay for him. Seeing her, he was reminded of her words from last time. "Don't let anyone become a reason to bind yourself," and found himself unable to say anything. Finally, he grasped the wrist of the person before him and somewhat stiffly pulled her into his embrace. "Audrey, we'll meet again." "Yes, very beautiful." Audrey nodded, her hair rustling against Fedor's suit. Fedor, his heart pounded. Though he hadn't drunk a drop, he felt strangely lightheaded. "My mother said the same thing. She told me to visit our homeland for her if I could. Fedor released her, his deep-set eyes crinkling as he smiled at her. Audrey drew near again, reaching out to give him another earnest hug. Fedor, if you come, you must come find me. She didn't know why she said that. Just as she couldn't describe the flutter in her heart at this very moment, Fedor paused, then gently returned her embrace. I will, Audrey. This embrace was gentler and more natural than before, yet just as perfectly fitted, because it was so tight. Audrey had to slightly bow her head to accommodate the much taller Fedor, his slightly long hair brushed against her neck, like a big dog's, tickling a little. Audrey boarded the plane alone. She truly didn't want to face the scene of farewell. So she chose to leave without saying goodbye. At this moment, she seemed to understand somewhat Fedor's reluctance to bid her farewell in person when he left before. If the day of reunion seems too distant, let life's uncertainties bring pleasant surprises. Returning to the dance troupe, Audrey received a warm welcome. Colleagues who had avoided her just 6 months ago now became unusually enthusiastic. Audrey once again felt as if a lifetime had passed, sensing that an eternity seemed to have gone by, but in the end, she said nothing, merely accepting it with a smile. As the day's training came to an end, Audrey planned to leave early because she still needed to look for a new place to live. Just as she reached the door, she heard Charlotte's tearful voice. Nigel, you've been gone for so long. I've missed you so much. Only half a year had passed. Yet Audrey found herself completely unfazed by the intimacy between Charlotte and Nigel. She paused for a brief moment before deciding to take a detour. Nigel's voice rang out with utter coldness. Charlotte, I've made myself perfectly clear to you before. Let me go. Charlotte didn't release him, her tears falling even harder. Have you already fallen for Audrey? This was an awkward question for Audrey. But in the next instant, Nigel's response nailed her to the spot. Yes, Charlotte's pride would no longer permit her to humble herself further. As she prepared to leave and pulled open the door, she collided with Audrey, who hadn't managed to dodge in time. Charlotte's tears continued to flow as she looked at Audrey with a hint of resentment. Audrey, you've won this time. Audrey quickly snapped back to reality and grabbed her wrist. I won. What did I win? A man's love. Love and life aren't dance competitions. And I don't want to win against you through a man. It's ridiculous, it's pathetic that we'd measure our worth through men. Charlotte was stunned, not expecting Audrey to say such a thing. She had never considered hurting her friend for the sake of a married man, yet she did it anyway, and the harm was undeniably done. Audrey, Charlotte called her name softly. Can we still be friends? Audrey pressed her lips together and shook her head. I don't know. Charlotte looked sorrowful and could only nod, saying, I understand. She glanced back at Nigel behind her and hurried away. Nigel walked toward her, his tone and gaze heavy, as if trying to imprint her into his heart. Audrey, to be honest, I don't want a divorce. The thought of not living with you is unbearable to me. You can accept the possibility of being friends with Charlotte again. Why can't you forgive me? Audrey faced him feeling like a block of wood, her gaze empty, her heart hollow. After 2 lifetimes, she felt neither love nor hatred toward Nigel. Span and those lingering resentments had long been uprooted, leaving only raw pain. Pain makes memories vivid, so there's no way she could forget how Nigel treated her. Nigel, Audrey heard herself call his name. What I regret most, in the end, is marrying you. Nigel never expected that such a simple sentence, spoken from Audrey's lips, could carry such devastating force. The pain in his heart nearly suffocated him. It took several deep breaths before he could rein in his emotions. During those 2 months apart from Audrey, Nigel had gone from indifference to realizing he'd only been pretending to be indifferent. In the end, that reluctant emotion made him compromise and admit that living with Audrey brought him happiness. Who wouldn't become addicted to happiness? So he could endure her recent neglect and indifference, even tolerate her intimate behavior with another man. He could endure it all, until she returned to him. Yet she said the thing she regretted most was marrying him. Nigel struggled to breathe, saying hoarsely, Audrey, I can change, I can let you keep dancing, you can do whatever you want, we'll be very happy. Audrey shook her head gently. Nigel, that's your happiness, not mine. As for what happened between you and Charlotte, truthfully I stopped caring long ago. We both pursue love, so I can understand. You can give up on me, give up on our marriage for the love of Charlotte, and I will leave you because you don't love me. That's fair, isn't it? The one I love is you. Audrey, Nigel took a step forward, trying to grasp her shoulders. Audrey, how can we ever go back to how we were before? What a heartfelt confession. Yet it came far too late. Audrey avoided his hand. That day, Charlotte was performing in the Nutcracker. I left the theater early, only to find the streets deserted. Everyone had flocked to see it. Charlotte's enormous poster hung right in the center, dazzling and radiant. I wanted to go home, but I didn't know where home was anymore. In her past life, She kept wondering why Nigel didn't love her. In this lifetime, she no longer wanted to ask for a reason, she only wondered why she couldn't leave, yet she chose to let go. That Nigel, who forced her to divorce so he could marry Charlotte, now claimed to love her. What does this even mean? Audrey truly couldn't tell anymore. By the end, Audrey's vision had blurred, yet she kept staring fixedly at Nigel, telling him her answer would absolutely not change. You don't have to have me, Nigel. I won't accept any wavering in marriage. We're truly over. My life is really good now. Please don't disturb me anymore. At this moment, Nigel finally understood what love is. Love is stripping away one's claws, willingly submitting, and respecting her choices. The two quickly went to the Civil Affairs Bureau, beginning the 30-day divorce cooling-off period. Afterward, Audrey went to the villa they had lived in together to pack her things. Nigel wasn't there, but Merlin was. The same confinement nanny was still looking after Merlin. Upon seeing Audrey, she was pleasantly surprised. "Madam, you're finally back." Audrey smiled and nodded at her. "Yes. You've been working hard all this time." The nanny wanted to say something more, but then she saw the large and small bags packed out of Audrey's room and was speechless. At this moment, Merlin, who had been quietly nestled in her arms, suddenly started fussing to get down. Audrey watched, saying nothing. 8-month-old Merlin walked towards her, holding onto the wall, step by step. His soft body tumbled onto her legs, and Audrey couldn't help but squat down. She loosely encircled Merlin. Not touching him, just preventing him from falling, Audrey said, "I have to work, so I can't be with you. You can continue to stay with your dad." Merlin tilted his head, trying to process her words. A moment later, realizing that Audrey meant she didn't want him, he instantly blinked out several large tears. He began to cry softly. "Mommy, Mommy." Audrey felt her heart ache at his crying. She stood up to leave, but a tiny hand grabbed her pant leg. The grip was weak, yet it rooted her to the spot. Merlin was the child she'd carried for 10 months. This bond was fundamentally different. Audrey stopped restraining herself and firmly embraced Merlin. The nanny also looked somewhat distressed and advised, "During those days you were gone, Mr. Nigel was very upset. I think he's already realized where he went wrong." Audrey remained silent. She detested this process of taming. In this marriage, she clearly wanted nothing, only to leave, yet in the end, it seemed as though she had deliberately used tactics to catch Nigel's attention. She only wanted to be Audrey, not some Mrs. Green or Merlin's mother. She had a choice and didn't want to compromise. Even if Nigel would respect her in the future, she never wanted to be his wife again. Staying by his and Merlin's side would only make her relive the misery of her past life over and over. This shadow, she didn't know how to reconcile with it, so she avoided contact. That was another known abyss and possibility. She didn't want to spend her whole life living in constant fear and the exhausting management of avoiding bad endings. Nigel hurried back from the office just in time to meet Audrey pulling her suitcase out the door. What he wanted to say came and went, until finally it became, "Come visit when you can. Merlin misses you a lot." Audrey nodded and said, "Okay." 30 days later, Audrey and Nigel went to the Civil Affairs Bureau and obtained their official divorce certificate. With that settled, she and Nigel could be family, but would never be lovers again. That same afternoon, Audrey performed in the theatre The Gazelle, OU Les Willis that had been postponed 6 months prior. She appeared on stage in a translucent tulle skirt, her toes never touching the ground, executing a series of petit jumps and pirouettes with bean-shaped feet. Her movements as light as falling snow, her arms stretched out like a swan at times, then curled like withered branches at others, her expression vacant yet tinged with sorrow, each step seeming to leave a transparent trail in the air. Audrey's dancing remained as heart-stirring as ever. The applause from the audience never ceased. Finally, as dawn pierced through the stage, Audrey's portrayal of Gazelle, OU Les Willis faded into nothingness. The male lead knelt on the ground, staring at the empty gravestone, with only a strand of white gauze drifting in the wind on the stage, just like Audrey's years of love and hatred, which ultimately came to an end and release. Audrey, as she stepped out of the dance troupe's door, a familiar and pleasant voice called from behind Audrey. Fedor, dressed in his usual casual attire, stood holding a bouquet of flowers while smiling at her, though they'd only been apart for little over a month. Audrey felt as if an eternity had passed, yet, this man remained as strikingly handsome as ever. "Fedor, it seems we're both free now." She laughed and dashed headlong toward life's new possibilities. The end.